listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I'm your indefatigable, your burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And that means that with us together, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. It is October 26th. It's just past 7 a.m. Eastern, and we've got another great show coming up for you. First up, though, we've got to get through our headlines. Let's get into COVID stats. Yesterday in the United States, there were 105,561 new COVID cases reported. There were also 1,414 new deaths in the U.S. from COVID-19. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 70,291 cases per day. That's a decrease of 22% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 57% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 66% of residents have received at least one dose of the COVID vaccine. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 45,528,926 people across the United States. Here in the U.S., it has killed 737,526 people. In national political news here in the States, yesterday 2 people were killed and 4 others, including a police officer, were injured in a shooting at a mall in Boise, Idaho. Details are sketchy, but the initial briefing by the police stated they responded to a call at the incident. When police arrived, they engaged the suspect, which led to an exchange of gunfire, injuring one officer and taking the suspect into custody. In international news, pro-democracy protesters in Sudan blocked roadways with makeshift barriers, burning tires, and placing other obstructions to show their displeasure with the coup that occurred yesterday. The United Nations Security Council is set to discuss the details of Sudan in a closed-door meeting today. At least 3 people are dead as a result of the fighting yesterday. Another 140 have been confirmed as having been wounded, and I've seen various international parties freezing their aid to Sudan due to the coup yesterday. Russia's foreign ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova has condemned statements made by Germany's caretaker defense minister yesterday, saying that Moscow should be aware that Germany would use nuclear deterrence against Russia if it were to attack a NATO member. Zakharova described these statements as unacceptable. A UN report this month detailing the status of North Korea, worrying of a quote-unquote human rights and humanitarian situation, is being rejected by that country. North Korean media and organizations are calling their report quote-unquote malicious slander and quote part of a U.S.-backed scheme to interfere with the national affairs of other countries, end quote. That is admittedly something the U.S. does. Europol has seized millions of euros worth of cash and Bitcoin and arrested 150 suspects involved in the dark web. That's a shadowy community of covert servers and web networks used for buying and selling illicit goods very often. Agents working with Operation Dark Hunter, and I want to come back to this, successfully confiscated 26.7 million euros, or about 31 million US dollars worth of cash and virtual currencies. They also took 45 guns and 516 pounds of drugs, including 25,000 ecstasy pills. That is 12,500 relationships that could have been instantly repaired that they just stole from people tomorrow. Hunger has risen to such extent in Afghanistan that parents are resolving to sell their children into marriage to afford food. Fahima is in such a situation, about to give up her 2 daughters for a marriage deal. Her daughters are 6 years old and 18 months old. The father has already made the agreement with 2 wealthy Afghans, stating they will all die if they do not go through with this deal. We should also come back to that. In business news, a rumor circulating on Twitter is that John Gruden is claiming that Jeff Bezos is nearing a deal to buy the Washington football team, as Dan Snyder is being forced to sell it. Reports of Bezos eyeing NFL ownership date back to 2018, so a couple years old at this point. Those rumors have been circulating. We'll see if it actually comes to pass. And in holiday news, today is National Chicken Fried Steak Day and Australian National Day. And with that, you're listening to Fault Lines. Those are our headlines. And there we go. All right, I want to go back. Let's start with a bad one. Afghanistan, where hunger has gotten so bad that parents are now selling their children, their infant children, into prearranged marriages in order to be able to afford food to stay alive.
That's very grim.
That is very grim.
And, we made the point before, at least I think we were, talking about whether or not Afghanistan is going to get some kind of assistance and aid, and that if it doesn't, well, it's going to slide off of a cliff. At that point, its currency was already being devalued. The main crop, heroin or the poppy seeds or whatever, they were ideologically against it. And our question was, well, wait a minute, I get they're ideologically against it, but if this is the only thing bringing in money, are they going to go with it? Well, it seems that they were going to be against it. I mean, the only way they were going to get help from China, Russia, and some of the other countries were to not be the world's premier, poppy seed maker. And so the question became, okay, what is Afghanistan going to do in order to keep itself from falling off of a cliff, or what is the Taliban going to do? And, there were really no good answers for that.
Well, the deal was they were going to get investment packages after they stopped producing opium. That was like the straw for China and Russia. That was the big factor there, I think, not just humanitarian aid, but also investment, specifically from China. But humanitarian aid, too. These countries aren't going to want to prop this government up if it's a source of drugs and unrest for them. If it's a destabilizing
country,
factor.
too, they're not going to want that.
Yeah, but on the other hand, if they stabilize the country and they keep, militant Islamists or whatever, the people who will die for the religion, from going into these countries, and if they stop the drug trade, then that's a big boon for these neighboring countries that have had to deal with this as a destabilizing force for so long. So of course, if the Taliban can go through with that, what I hear though is that the investment hasn't come yet, and who knows how long they'll be able to last. And I don't know if what is a Taliban-led government gonna look like? How will they be able to retain control if the state is in an absolute dysfunction? If people are starving, if that doesn't just last for months but starts to last for years? How does that work? Well,
and not just that. I mean, the Taliban is taking power after, 20 years of war, maybe even more than 20 years of war, and like brutal scenarios that these guys were engaged in. And then all of a sudden it's now we have to go to governance. And even though they might have been more sophisticated than the first batch of Taliban, well, they still have to deal with all of these people that have only known war for all of this time.
Yeah, put down the sword, pick up the pen, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And be able to govern, be able to run various governmental systems, be it the airport, be it just the typical way of the things that government do that we never even think about what they do because, they just do it almost immediately, almost automatically. Well, they have to do all of that, and they have to do all of that from scratch, basically. And like you said, the fact that the money is being devalued, the fact they still have terrorism going on there from, people blowing up stuff. I mean, it was just the bombing the other day. That's a lot to have to do on the fly, and have to not necessarily have a functioning economy on top of that. It's like, the guy I remember in the Afghanistan files, they said the only thing that was working there was the drug trade. And he's like, what? That's the only thing that's working there? And so it's like now that's being undermined. So, yeah, man, Afghanistan was always going to have a hard way to go. And, that was kind of why I was so adamant about we really need to assist. We really need to assist. Because my thought is, you think they're monsters there now. Wait till that place fall off of a cliff and you don't have the ability to get food, or you have these kind of other groups that are springing up that are worse than the Taliban, or worse than these kind of elements of ISIS, in order to try to create some kind of, some semblance of a lifestyle in the country. And I guess that's kind of where we are. That's grim. I mean, selling your kids. I don't think any parent, they love their kids as much as anybody does. And if anything, this is kind of getting across what is the bottom line that people are willing to go to when things get that bad or that horrific.
Maybe or maybe not. Maybe there's a cultural difference where they actually don't. And I'm not saying this on a human level. I know that starts to feel like, well, what are you actually saying there? I'm not saying on a human level. I'm saying a cultural difference. I don't feel like again, imagine hearing a story about Americans selling their kids into slavery, or not slavery, but into early marriages as infants in order for them to be able to afford food. That wouldn't be a culturally accepted thing. Immediately, it would be like, okay, let's put these people in prison. What's the most convenient law to use to put those parents in prison, right? That would be the response here.
Yeah, but you have to also, you can't take everything out and just say, okay, America doing this in a vacuum.
No,
this wouldn't be America doing this in a vacuum. This would be America in the same situations of Afghanistan.
Serious decline after decades of war, whatever.
Thing. It's like if America was taken over by some kind of hostile alien force, would it go to suicide bombing in order to try to push back? Of course it would. I wouldn't, I don't necessarily think that's entirely a cultural thing. I think that's the situations that we're presented with as human beings, and we come up with horrible, horrible outcomes
That's
for
what
it.
culture is in
Yeah.
some sense.
Well,
I'll make that case.
Let's put it this way. If there was a war and you were in a situation where you needed to feed your family, would you take food from an elderly person on the street or take meds from an elderly person on the street in order to feed your family or give those meds to your family? And I don't think that's cultural. I mean, there'll be some people who say, okay, I can't go that route. I'll just let my kids die. And there'll be other people who say, yeah, I'm not going to let my kids die. I'm going to do whatever I have to do in order to make that work. That's not really a cultural thing. That's a human thing, that people get put in these kind of weird situations. I mean, I understand your point. I mean, but what is a family to do? And this is not me saying rah, rah, great, sell your kids stuff. It's more so, do I think that people can be in such horrific situations that they will...
This is the rational choice for them to make.
And it's grim to even consider.
Of course, I understand, and I hear the point there. I feel like we've already established our lines. I want to go back to the Europol story.
Yeah.
This one. The Europol seizing millions of euros. Are you familiar with the dark web?
It's like the underlying web, right? It's like okay, then no.
No. It's not it's not like dark matter.
No,
it's not like the dark web is like the unseen part of the internet.
No, I thought it was like the underlying things where it's not necessarily pictures and everything else. It's like the text.
No. So dark web is a term that's been used for basically, do you remember the onion router? This might help us set it up. So the onion router, in the earlier days of the internet before cryptocurrencies and all that, remember the Snowden days back 2012, 2013, that era. The onion router was a tool that people would use so that their communications couldn't be intercepted directly off their computer. So instead of, you have a computer, it's interfacing with servers in order to get to websites, get their data, and then that communication can be directly intercepted. Your ISP, theoretically, the government could be working with your ISP to monitor your communications at the base level, right? It just intercepts your requests, what you receive, those kinds of things from your modem effectively on that level, basically. And so the onion router is a way to get around this, where basically instead of having your request for a website go directly from your computer to the server of that website, it gets pinged around this sort of anonymous network of servers. You think of like an actual physical onion, the vegetable, with these different layers that you have to peel back to get to it. The idea is that you're sort of obfuscating who's visiting a website, where you're going. So somebody who's monitoring your ISP, it can't tell what exactly you're requesting. All it sees is a sort of encrypted message, encrypted thing getting sent out, getting pinged around anonymously between these servers. And as it tries to track it, you don't know, it's just too hard to trace. The theory is somebody who's trying to intercept your communications can't figure out what you're accessing, what you're actually reading, where you're getting it from, any of that stuff.
They just see a data packet coming from point A to point B.
So that was an early version of the dark web or whatever. That was a way for people, not exactly, but that was a way for people to sort of cover their tracks while they're navigating stuff online. Then cryptocurrency stuff pops up, and that adds a sort of another layer to it because people are able to use cryptocurrencies, which, a part of the point is they're crypto. It's a secret currency. People don't know exactly who holds a wallet. It's anonymized. And so if you connect that idea with the onion router idea, suddenly you have access. Nobody can track what websites you're visiting. Nobody can track what transactions you're making, so what you're purchasing. What this sets up is naturally a black market online. A lot of people want to buy stuff, whether it's drugs or child porn or guns or
they don't want people to see that they're buying that child porn or guns. Yeah.
Exactly. And so there's been this long-term cat and mouse game of finding people who are using these illicit services, and apparently this one came through. But again, some of this stuff, 26, they're selling drugs and probably guns.
Yeah.
And that is probably a bad thing. But I also can't help but feel like maybe, I don't know, maybe our society needs some better way of, I'm probably more in the legalization camp is my point on this stuff specifically. Our society probably needs some better way of dealing with this than forcing people to go in the black market and then raiding tens of millions of dollars when we catch them doing it. I don't know. It's just dysfunctional.
Wait, what do you mean?
About it.
I mean, you mean people, the society has a better way of doing child porn?
No, because that's not what they were selling. I was talking about drugs.
No, you're talking about drugs and guns, but you were saying the dark web was also being used for like child porn and some of this other stuff.
Again, it's getting more into a philosophical case, and I was just going there from the story, which is interesting enough to me in itself. Yeah. But then, I'm more for legalization. It would probably be better if we minimize the incentives to do these kinds of things, so that when it is child porn, in the rare cases where that's happening, when it's the truly bad stuff, it's easier for us to find it. There's less of a moral gray zone. Because for me, it's like guns and drugs. Admittedly, in Europe, the gun situation is different. Guns in the States, Maybe more people are able to buy. You can pretty
Right.
much buy anywhere.
Yeah.
Drugs, admittedly, you can't buy anywhere, but drugs are getting increasingly legalized. I guess my sense is it would be great if this activity could take place above the board,
Yeah.
be taxable, not be completely secretive and therefore potentially screwy for the people involved in it, like black markets are, where things tend to get violent and scammy and all that stuff. I don't know. That's my point.
I guess the thing is, I guess the question becomes, are there going to be things that are illegal? Yeah or nay? And if they're going to be things that are illegal on some level, invariably, there's going to be a black market for it. I mean, the child porn probably is the most vilest case, so I just use that as the precedent. Kids can't consent to sex because kids can't consent to sex.
Which is why there should. I'm not saying that black markets should just be legal. I'm saying, which is it's impossible. I'm not saying that. I'm saying probably we should reduce the degree to which we're having to protect against all these things being sold on black markets, so that we can focus our energies on the ones that are doing the truly unquestionably bad stuff.
That I agree with.
That's my major point.
For example, drugs. I think all drugs should be legal.
That's where I'm going with this. That's where
I don't think people. I mean, I think
I'm not even sure if I want all drugs to be legal. But my point is, I said it in a slightly roundabout way. Maybe is probably drugs should be legal, because if they were, this kind of thing wouldn't be as big of a deal.
Legalize it. You have more control over it. I mean, look at what they did to pot in Maryland. It was like, okay, we're going to get a badge for it, and most people are like, hey man, I can get pot for legally. I don't necessarily need to breach the laws of these, whatever rules they set up around it. The state has more ability to kind of monitor it, as opposed to, pot is illegal. People are being locked up and thrown into a cage. Cops are spending all of this time and money and resources doing it. I mean, even alcohol prohibition, when these guys made alcohol illegal, and you had all of these gangs that were basically making tons of money off of illegal alcohol, but also huge amounts of violence and killing and everything else. No, I think I agree with the point. Keep the black market stuff for very heinous stuff, but all things being equal, cut down on the legalities of some of this other stuff. I agree with that.
And there's something in me that's like a little bit more like cyberpunk, and just not, again, the child porn stuff is truly bad.
Yeah.
But like the idea that you have black markets where you're buying like drugs and pills and guns and things.
Yeah.
I'll admit it's probably technically like morally bad, but there's something pretty cool about it too.
About the black market.
You gotta give it
depends on what it is, right?
It's like you can just imagine like people wearing like those visors, like those completely black like cyberpunk visors.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like Blade Runner style or whatever.
If somebody was buying a hitman to whack a despot, okay, maybe.
You could see it being kind of cool. Like, it's like in the year 73 or whatever.
But if it's, but some of the other stuff is just vile. Yeah, man, it's a difficult question. I mean, it gets to the whole thing of legality versus illegality, and what things should be legal versus not illegal. And, what roles does the state have in making certain things illegal? And sometimes what you invariably get to is there's certain things that they're going to make illegal that are not immoral. It's just the state making a choice that says this is going to be illegal, and sometimes it causes more problems than it's worth. But yeah, it just kind of depends on what it is.
Let's take us into a break.
Yeah.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, going into a break. We'll be back in a minute.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C., and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in with the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So there is an interesting comment made by Ajamu Baraka that I thought was fascinating, actually. It says right here, the right to, and I'll just read the article. He put this comment on an article that came out. This is CNN Business, and it says, Quote, Facebook knew it was being used to incite violence in Ethiopia. It did little to stop the spread, documents show. Again, Facebook, a social media company, platform, knew it was being used to incite violence in Ethiopia. It did little to stop the spread, documents show. Now, one of the things that we always come away with, especially in a large part of the fight that was taking place during the Trump administration over social media, was this notion between a platform versus a publisher. A publisher is held liable because it is publishing content and it makes a certain decision on what it wants to publish, who it wants to publish, and the content of that publishing. A platform doesn't entirely have that level of capability. A platform is indeed a platform. It's basically a billboard. It stands there. And people who are in social media are going to put in what they're going to put in. Social being the key word for this, meaning you're going to get all sorts of people putting in all sorts of things and all sorts of opinions that run the gambit. One of these other catches, however, is that social media has been weaponized many times by intelligence services and by militaries who want to try to push certain revolutions, inhibit other things, attack the governments of other countries, or again, inhibit the attacks of governments on particular countries. It's a free-for-all. The key point, though, is I want to stress is the issue of being a platform versus a publisher. Is it the responsibility for Facebook or Twitter to be the arbiter of truth, to be the arbiter of correctness? Is it really the responsibility of Facebook to go in and censor various content that it deems to be objectionable, morally or otherwise, or unethical, or just what they consider to be wrong? Now, it is true that Section 230 allows a certain degree of caveat on this point, meaning Section 230 is kind of like a sword and a shield in the way that it's used. It can restrict access to any content they deem objectionable. But keep in mind, there are caveats to this. This is not necessarily a broad brush. Right here, I'll just read it. Wyden likens the dual nature of Section 230 to be a sword and a shield for platforms. Keyword platforms. They're shielded from liability for user content, and they have a sword to moderate it as it sees fit. And again, they're shielded from the things that people say because, again, they're a platform. They're not supposed to be making a choice. The Communications Decency Act, which was signed into law into 1996, the indecency and obscenity provisions, which make it a crime to transmit such speech if it could be viewed by a minor, were immediately challenged by civil liberty groups. The Supreme Court would ultimately strike them down, saying they were too restrictive for free speech. Section 230 stayed, and the law that was initially meant to restrict free speech on the internet instead became the law to protect it. Again, this is a sword and shield notion. There are some things that a company can say, okay, this is too far. We don't like people signing on to ISIS. We don't like people passing on kiddie porn. Yes, that's true. From the other side of it, though, you can't necessarily just say, I don't like that guy because that guy is making a certain political speech and I just want to get him off the platform. At that point, it's not a platform. The person is acting as a publisher, and that group can be held liable and responsible for what is being put on their publishing platform. The point that I'm making here is CNN is writing an article. Facebook knew it was being used to incite violence in Ethiopia. It did little to stop the spread, documents show. Is that really Facebook's job? Understand what I'm saying here. Whether it's right-wingers, whether it's lefties, whether it's groups who are supporting Palestine, whether it's Telesur and some of these other companies, Facebook, Twitter, got rid of many of these groups, stuff that the left would find objectionable, meaning we hate the fact that you're getting rid of Palestinian groups who are talking about being brutalized by, let's say, Israelis, or we hate the fact that you're getting rid of Telesur when the U.S. government was basically working in opposition to Venezuela, it still is. But by the same token, that same logic applies to this, right? What right, what responsibility does Facebook have to be the arbiter of truth? Meaning CNN is basically saying Facebook should take certain action against these other actors, and they should prevent people from being able to have certain conversations about this particular state, this particular country, or the things that are taking place in that country. Keep in mind, this is also within the context of the mainstream media basically saying Facebook and Twitter should take various actions more heavily to censor content they don't particularly like. And again, this gets to this question of, well, what is Facebook? Is it a platform or is it a publisher? I know for myself, being on YouTube, that YouTube has taken my channel down because it disagreed with something that was being said, only to put the content back up a few days later with an apology. Our bad, we were too aggressive. What do you mean you were too aggressive? You're basically making a choice to take down or to keep up based upon what you yourself wanted, almost acting as if you're a publisher. I'm making a point that the social media platforms really need to make a determination on what they are. Are they publishers or are they platforms? And if they're platforms, this idea of censorship or this idea of saying we're going to allow this, but we're going to disallow that, again, within certain regions of illegality, needs to put a stop to. Yes, the federal government has been on this push and pull thing of saying, we need you to censor more. And other people saying, we need you to censor less, which has allowed social media companies to basically do whatever's the most profitable for those social media companies. That needs to, on some level, change. It is not the job of Twitter or Facebook to basically be arbiters of truth. They're social media platforms. And on some level, that needs to be clarified to what that means, as opposed to this kind of gray area where you have CNN basically saying, we need to stop the platform for presenting this, or the platform should take more action to stop X or to stop Y. And oftentimes, again, these things are political positions or political persuasions. It goes too far. A choice needs to be made. What are social media platforms, and what are the limits of their capabilities? And is that limit to shut down the speech of a president or shut down the speech of political actors that they don't particularly like, especially when it doesn't necessarily breach the laws? That needs to be clarified. And I would make the point that right now, it is not clear at all. CNN is basically saying Facebook should have been an arbiter of truth. It should have been an arbiter to decide what it wants to put or what it doesn't want to put. And I'm making a point that that is not Facebook's job. It runs flat into the face of Section 230 and whether or not Facebook is a platform and publisher. And it seems, whether it's Congress, whether it's CNN, these guys are asking Facebook to be more of a publisher while maintaining the securities or the benefits of a platform. Ajamu Baraka made the point, the right of information and speech is under assault by neoliberal authoritarians, and Facebook in the crosshairs is not being censoring enough. Here's a perfect example, making a point about this very particular article where they're saying Facebook should have censored the content from Ethiopia. Where does that end? Where does that end? And is it a platform or is it a publisher? And again, I make the point that it's supposed to be a platform, despite the fact that you have politicians, political leaders, and the like of CNN, these kind of media arms, basically saying, you need to be more of a publisher. Nonsense. That stuff needs to be clarified. And I don't necessarily know what that clarification is right now. Shane, what are your thoughts? I mean, we were around during the time where Congress was basically doing this pull and pull, one group saying, we need you to censor more, and another group saying, we need you to censor less. And basically whether it's YouTube, Facebook, or for that matter, Twitter, they're kind of in the middle of this. And ultimately, they just make the choice, all right, what's most profitable, and let's go that particular route. And not even just what's most popular. Sometimes these things are being used almost as intelligence services, like I mentioned earlier, where the military gets involved in order to attack other countries and to try to create all sorts of chaos, or for that matter, stem chaos in our own countries in the way that it's being utilized. Either way, they need to make a choice on whether they're platforms and whether they're publishers, and that needs to be clarified, whatever that is, because right now they're in this kind of weird gray area where they're basically will shut down Telesur, they will shut down certain Palestinian sites, and in this case, go after, or for that matter, shut down various speech in Ethiopia when they don't particularly like the speech that is being had. What are your thoughts?
I think the big question here is when Republicans take power, again, are they going to use the social media platforms in the same way that Democrats are using them now, which is to try to shut down suppressing dissenting opinions? Because let's say Republicans take power and they do that. Then that's the worst of all worlds and we're doomed. Let's say for a second they don't do that. Well, then what comes after that? How do social media companies respond to that? Yeah. You're having this conversation, which is, I think, what the conversation is. Okay, are they platforms? Are they publishers? Where exactly is the line here? In some sense, is that the politicians might be deciding that. But I don't know. It feels like that's a decision that I don't trust them at all to make. And frankly, they're probably going to want to do whatever they can to make sure they can have their cake and eat it too, in terms of having the protections, giving these companies. If I had to paint a sort of dream world for the establishment on this one, in terms of, okay, use these to control information to run our society as well as we possibly can, get what we want done, that kind of thing. What you want is for those platforms to be protected from all legal scrutiny by the public, so they can't be sued, and for you to control them completely. Yeah. So in other words, you sort of want them...
Best of both worlds.
Best of both worlds, right? You want them to be unassailable like a platform.
While being able to censor whatever they want in the process. Or censor whatever we want.
Whatever we want from them, like a publisher. And in some sense, that's the inevitable trend or tendency that I would expect from an impartial government as such. You know, not people, not their ideology, which wants to do things with government, but government as such just wants more power so it can do more of whatever it wants. And in democracy, you know, the kind of propaganda we're talking about with Facebook and these other social media companies, super important. As we're discovering. What do I think is going to happen? I think it really does depend on how exactly Republicans treat this when they take power again, because it's clear that Democrats are pushing it in one direction, Republicans are sort of pushing back in another. If the tables turn, well, I'm just curious what happens. That's the big question I'm asking on this one.
And I don't know the answer to that either. I mean, at this point, it seems like they're trying to skate on this notion of, yes, they're platforms, however, we need you to censor more and more information, which is like, dude, you're not a platform if you're continuously censor information. Yeah. Like, it's one thing if something is illegal, like joining ISIS. Okay, fair enough. I get that, right? Or screaming fire into a crowded theater. Fair enough. I get that. But some of the stuff is not that. I mean, like I said, with the YouTube stuff where they shut down the channel, they shut down the channel over something they just disagreed with. And then 2 days later, oh, our bad, we were a little too aggressive. What do you mean you were a little too aggressive? I mean, you're basically acting as if you're a publisher for this content, not necessarily a platform. A platform wouldn't have even engaged the conversation in the first place. Nothing said it was wrong. Nothing said it was illegal. There were no anything that was creating or inciting violence. None of that stuff.
One more thing before we go into our break. I've been trying to, I realized there was another thing I wanted to get to, but I forgot exactly what it was. Talking about Jamarl Thomas on that CNN article, where they're talking about Ethiopia specifically. Exactly. Ethiopia is this, okay, you know, we should have been, Facebook should have intervened more. Yes. Basically. Which I saw another article, which I think came out before that. It's part of a wave. I'll put it like this. Another article talking about Facebook in Vietnam. If you look up Vietnam Facebook, you'll see what I'm talking about. There are a rash of them that have come out, a whole spate. Facebook should have been intervening more in Vietnam. Look, see, the Vietnamese government had Facebook basically not take down certain posts. They were, you know, they're saying that the Vietnamese government was in control of what Facebook was doing.
Facebook bowed to Vietnam government censorship demands.
Same thing with the Ethiopian government, right? It's that basically they're not being heavy-handed in terms of local coverage and local propaganda and stuff. What they want is for that here in the States, right? Yeah. They expect Facebook to do what everybody in the mainstream media and political establishment wants them to do, which is to suppress stuff that's dangerous for Joe Biden or whatever.
But keep in mind, it's a platform. It's not a media organization.
I don't feel like those categories matter. I feel like those are categories that we're getting distracted by in the political conversation over. Again, if they were going to want the best of both worlds, then that dichotomy is meaningless in some sense, because they're going to try to gamesmanship those definitions. They're going to try to rule those rewrite the rules of exactly how it works and confuse people. Yeah. That's my take. But again, maybe I'm oversimplifying things.
Well, no. I mean, look, at the point where Facebook bowed to government pressure, you have another one. Facebook papers show free speech hypocrisy on Vietnam. Here's another one. Raw story. Facebook Zuckerberg gave personal approval to censor critics in the Vietnam government. So in one story, well, he censored them. And in the other story, they're not censoring enough, I suppose.
They're just getting hit on whatever they can get hit on, basically. And it's partly, and this is an angle that my dad likes to bring up sometimes, the battle between old media and new media. And that is another sort of interesting incentive, industry-wide incentive, which is traditional media really doesn't like social media because it gutted their profits. Yes. You know, so much of, big time. Look at a newspaper, for instance, they had to completely change their profit model, you know, their business model, once the internet came about, and they couldn't rely on paper sales, and they had to start relying on ads and subscriptions and, you know, digital subscriptions, stuff like that. And it's still kind of flaky. Some have found a grounding anyway.
Not to mention social media basically shows those articles just as a basis of going.
Oh, yeah, you can just read
Facebook, Twitter. Yeah, you can just read all that stuff.
You can find them.
So, yeah, they hate it. I mean, it's the YouTube apocalypse stuff was basically CNN, many of the other organizations writing articles saying, look at all of the stuff that's on social media in order to gut sales, to get those people back to the mainstream media in regards to putting those advertisements in.
And I can see that too. But at the same time, there's also this purpose to use social media as a lever of controlling what the public has access to. And one of the most important parts of this, segueing out, because I don't want to keep our guest on the line without bringing him on for too long, is with COVID stuff, of course, and specifically this gain of function theory about gain of function, the National Institute of Health, or the National Institutes of Health, NIH, whether they were funding gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Lab of Virology in China, and them having to now just admit that, in fact, they were, after for months people had been, had been pushing back against it. There's been this whole back and forth where they'd been denying it consistently, and people who'd been saying that had been getting blocked, and their posts had been getting suppressed all over social media. And there had been a concerted political campaign, like our guest that we're about to be speaking with has told us about before, sort of from the inside, with scientists who were acting very ascientific, but writing internal letters,
political stances,
taking political stances in what should be fundamentally scientific issues, matters of truth and not of power or whatever. We got to go into a break. We're going to be coming back with Dr. Jean Ollinger, virologist, great guest, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with Dr. Ollinger in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want the report.
Let's talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So we are in the wake of basically the NIH coming out saying, okay, fair enough. We were doing gain-of-function research. And as Shane kind of made the point before, people were being blocked, people were being called conspiracy theorists, and also other things on top of that. What's interesting is that the definition of it changed. NIH changed basically the definition to which they were using before. The first definition went along to this notion of we only use this in certain laboratories, and we have to take all sorts of precautions in order to ensure that the people don't get sick and the staff and so forth are safe and that these viruses don't get out, to basically just giving a basic bland definition of gain of function on top of that.
You're talking about a written description on the website, right?
On the website, right. And it was a drastic difference in regards to those two items. And it was, let's say, coincidental, to put it mildly, that definition change came after it was made aware that the NIH was conducting research into gain of function. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Jean Ollinger. Dr. Jean Ollinger is a professor at Boston University, the principal science advisor for MRI Global, Inc., and a recipient of the NIH Director Award in 2015 for his efforts assisting with Ebola outbreak in Western Africa. He's also conducted and supervised in vitro and in vivo experiments in maximum biocontainment, focusing on high-consequence pathogens and biodefense. Dr. Jean, welcome to the show again. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, no problem. Good morning. Thank you for having me on again.
Absolutely. Always enriched by your presence on the show. And so this kind of goes into what we were talking about before, about the way that the NIH basically, okay. I mean, basically, they're going to point the finger at Eco-Alliance, but basically we're engaged in gain-of-function research, to which they're saying they accidentally stumbled onto. There was a big fight between Fauci and Rand Paul that gained a lot of popularity that I want to play the clip on, and I want to get your take on in the wake of what we now know, that the NIH was by accident or intention supporting. Let's play this clip.
Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement of May 11th where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, I have never lied before the Congress, and I do not retract that statement. This paper that you are referring to was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain of function. Let me finish.
You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans, right. You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct. And Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about, quite frankly, and I want to say that officially. You do not know what you are talking about. Okay, you get NIH, one person.
Let's read from the NIH definition of gain of function. This is your definition that you guys wrote. It says that scientific research that increases the transmissibility among mammals is gain of function. They took animal viruses that only occur in animals, and they increased their transmissibility to humans. How you can say that is not gain of function?
It is not.
It's a dance, and you're dancing around this because you're trying to obscure responsibility for 4 million people dying around the world from a pandemic.
And let's send Dr. Fauci.
I have to, well, now you're getting into something. If the point that you are making is that the grant that was funded as a sub-award from EcoHealth to Wuhan created SARS-CoV-2. That's where you are getting. Let me finish.
We don't know.
Well,
wait
a minute.
It did come from the lab, but all the evidence is pointing that it came from the lab, and there will be responsibility for those who funded the lab, including yourself.
I totally
This committee will allow the witness to respond.
I totally resent the lie that you are now propagating, Senator, because if you look at the viruses that were used in the experiments, that were given in the annual reports, that were published in the literature, it is molecularly impossible.
No one's saying those viruses caused it.
It
no
is
one is molecularly that those viruses caused the pandemic. What we're alleging is that gain-of-function research was going on in that lab, and NIH funded it.
That is
you can't
not
get away from it. It meets your definition, and you are obfuscating the truth.
I'm not obfuscating the truth.
Senator
You're
Paul's
the one.
Time is expired, but I will allow the witness to.
Let me just finish. I want everyone to understand that if you look at those viruses, and that's judged by qualified virologists and evolutionary biologists, those viruses are molecularly impossible to result in SARS-CoV-2.
Cause the pandemic. We're saying they are gain-of-function viruses because they were animal viruses that became more transmissible in human, and you funded it.
And you
admit the truth.
And you implying.
Senator Paul, your time has expired, and I will allow witnesses who come before this committee to respond.
And you are implying that what we did was responsible for the deaths of individuals. I totally resent that. And if anybody is lying here, Senator, it is you.
All right. That is heated, to put it mildly.
This is an older clip.
Yeah, it is. I mean, but this was the original back and forth.
This is the original gladiatorial combat. My point is this isn't new, but this is the big thing that's been happening.
Yeah. And so I guess there's a few points. It clearly is gain of function. I mean, the definition that Rand Paul described was gain of function. It seems like he goes too far when he's making the point of saying, like, you know, you guys are responsible for 4 million deaths and everything else. It goes too far. But it does sound like gain of function. Dr. Ollinger, what do you think about that? Just in reference to what we know now about the research that was taking place, is Fauci being dishonest here?
I wouldn't say he's being dishonest, but it kind of reminds me of the days of Bill Clinton kind of explaining that he didn't have relations with...
Definition of is.
Definition of is, right? Right.
When you're really, really smart, and he's a smart man both politically and also, you know, scientifically, you know how to dance around the game. But the reality is that both are wrong. You know, one, as a scientist, you need to be open to the idea that things may have happened in a way that you don't really understand. So, for example, the data that you have, which is published data, the data that's been made available through reports is not all the data. I can tell you that there's many, many reports that I never wrote up because I didn't have time to do them. And so there's lots of data that always sits around that, you know, oh, one day I'll get to that, I'll write that up. And so there's a large amount of data that doesn't get published because it doesn't fit, you know, any type of comment, you know, kind of idea that would make any sense to anyone other than yourself. Although it should be provided. I mean, one of the great examples of this is my team helped do a lot of the early drug development for SARS and MERS, which is before SARS-CoV-2, using FDA-approved drugs. And we found lots of drugs that worked, including ivermectin. Unfortunately, though, none of those worked in a second round of animal studies and, you know, what they call follow-ups. Figure it out. And, of course, you know, that doesn't get published because negative data doesn't get published.
I'm glad you brought this up. Somebody in our chat had asked us to ask you about this, actually, because I think they'd looked into your work. And, you know, there are a lot of people who are curious about ivermectin and support its use and stuff with SARS-CoV-2. It asked us to. Thank you for bringing it up. I mean, sorry for cutting in. It's just super apropos because you went there.
It's exciting, you know, those results are exciting because we are looking for cheap, effective ways to treat people and, of course, prevent disease, ideally. And, you know, existing drugs in some parts of the world is the best way to do that. So that was the goal. And, of course, those things don't work, so you don't publish those. And the same thing here. There's probably a ton of data that's just not available. Now, regarding the process, I mean, again, you, as a scientist, you make the declaration this is not a dual-use project. And this was all occurring around the time this proposal was going in, 2000. 2014-15. And there were issues. There were serious issues that were, now have come to light. But again, there's a slippery slope of, well, as a scientist, I don't think this is a dual use research.
What do you mean by that? This is the second time you said that. Sorry about that. But what do you mean by dual use project or dual use research?
Well, dual use are, pathogen, potentially hazardous work that could occur. So this is the concept around what's going on here. This idea that you could do work that would have potentially a biosafety, biosecurity risk where it could leak out of the lab.
There's like a risk-benefit analysis that comes into play, like much more of one where you might really want to do the research as a preventative or as medical research effectively, or it could escape. You could have those serious problems, basically like a double-edged sword kind of thing, right?
It's opening Pandora's box. I mean, if you're going out in the wild looking for something that could infect you, it could infect you. So it's that danger that exists there. So you have to have the proper safety and security programs in place, which is the levels of biosafety that we have in the U.S. and across the international community, which is level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. And level 4 is where you wear a spacesuit, and it's extremely sensitive. We make sure the people working there are safe. We make sure that the facility itself has very little chance of anything leaking out of it. And that's where this work should have been, done. And there's even, some evidence that was a question back to 2015. And I'm sorry, I'm looking at dates here, but in the early 2017, there was there's a State Department, kind of like, hey, where's this work occurring? Is it occurring in the right safety level? And there was a lot of concerns that were brought up even before that time point. And we don't have complete transparency with a partner like this, and this is always a question when you start to delve into this. But as a scientist, if you were EcoHealth, you wrote this and said, well, this is for the betterment of mankind, so this is, I'm going to justify this as not being anything potentially dangerous, and we'll do everything safe. And that's probably what happened with internal reviews as well at NIH and others.
Basically, that there was a potential for them to know in advance that this was going to lead to what it led to. I got a question. Fauci also made this point of saying it is molecularly impossible. Is that true? Yeah. And what does he mean by that?
Molecularly impossible. I wrote that down too. Molecularly impossible for the virus that they were doing the research on to result in SARS-CoV-2.
To basically result in coronavirus.
Right there. He's exactly correct. If you look at the sequences, so we look at the genomic sequences of the viruses, and we look at a phylogenetic tree, much like you would do ancestry, for your family members. You can look at the family members of viruses and say, okay, where is the ancestral link between these two? And right now, the sequences we have for SARS-CoV-2, they're close, but there's no direct link between the two, and it's hard to make any assessments that this is, SARS-CoV-2 came from this, variant from the lab in Wuhan. That is the smoking gun, and it doesn't exist. And so, but again, we don't have all the data, and we have the data that's been published. We have the data that's been put in reports, but there could have been something that they didn't even pay attention to that happened in the lab and never got sequenced.
Real quick on that, when you say you don't have all the data, I thought that the genome of, admittedly, the wild-type variant that was first identified or whatever, the first batch, I thought that was released in like February of last year. I thought the genome of that virus of SARS-CoV-2, again, I'm trying to clarify, not the variants, basically. I thought that was widely available. What data wouldn't the community have at this point?
The data we wouldn't have is data that would be, data that was in the lab, samples that were processed that never got sequenced, data that processed samples that were sequenced but just didn't make any sense and weren't, really looked at further. So there's other data always in research that doesn't get data that doesn't get analyzed to the point where it can actually be processed.
Okay. That makes sense. Thanks for the point of clarification there. Another thing, this is sort of how Jamarl led us in here, but this is also super relevant to what seems to be the immediate backpedaling of the NIH as an institution from this stuff, which is the rule rewrite, or the definition rewrite on their website. I don't know if you've seen this, but this has been making the rounds in some news spheres where basically there was a page on their website where they'd listed previously a definition of gain of function, and then just a couple of days ago, basically as this story was breaking in the limited way that it has, They rewrote that page so that gain of function, you basically can't find that phrase on that page. Instead, it's replaced with like this other acronym, EPPP, Enhanced Pandemic Potential Pathogen, I think is the phrase, but I'm doing that from memory, but it's pretty close to it.
Yeah.
Anyway, the point is, they did, have you seen that, Dr. Ollinger?
I was looking for that last night too, and I haven't seen the specific changes. I mean, it's not unrealistic. The changes are we're changing the term. Dual use is really not the term. It's being used quite a bit now. It's the PP3.
But it seems like they changed it immediately after it was uncovered that the NIH was basically doing the gain of function research, or at the very least was paying for what ended up being gain of function.
Yeah, like
that's not coincidental.
Either covering the tracks or just minimizing the severity of how bad this seems.
Probably, honestly, in my opinion, it's probably just a change that's occurring because of the safety board that works on these topic areas has met. And this is the new term they want to use, and it just coincided with these issues. But it does, it's something that. I mean, think about it. The NIAID organization is a $6 billion, organization. It's the funding that they provide for science and research right now. So it's a large organization and it has a lot going on. So it's likely that this got put put aside. It's also possible that it was changed on purpose. So you never know really what the intent was.
Well, just to point something out, the Wuhan lab and the laboratory that was basically doing the research, were they set up for the kind of level of biocontainment necessary for gain of function research?
Oh, absolutely. It's a very high technology, high containment, maximum containment laboratory. So it has BSL-3 and BSL-4 facilities. Now, of course, does it mean they did the work in 4 or 3? They could have done the work in 2 or 2+. So it's that's a lower level when you get to the lower level numbers. So it's possible that the work was done in an appropriate location as well.
Because it's just the definition that they were using prior for gain of function. The research poses biosafety and biosecurity risk, and these risks must be carefully managed. When supported with NIH funds, the subset of gain of function research may only be conducted in laboratories with stringent oversight and appropriate biosafety and biosecurity controls to help researchers from infection and prevent the release of microorganisms into the environment. While this basically changes. It says, while the new definition reads, quote, a type of research that modifies a biological agent so that it confers new or enhanced activity to the agent. That just seems to be a very significant change in the way that they're describing these two things.
Super timely. Again.
Yeah, and very timely. That's all. It just seems like if what they were doing in the research involved gain of function, let's, benefit of the doubt. Let's say it was something that they just stumbled upon as opposed to something that they weren't trying to intentionally do. And they weren't using the level of biocontainment that was necessary for a typical gain of function type of project. Well, it just seems like this definition removes a lot of the emphasis on biocontainment, safety risk, security, et cetera, and just goes into straight definition of enhanced potential pandemic pathogen, which basically a type of research that modifies a biological agent to confers new or enhanced activity for the agent. That just seems conspicuous. That's all. That's all I was getting at. It seems that.
Yeah, it's a little concerning. I can see in your time points, but without a little bit more insight, it'd be nice to know, why that was made at that time. If it was really just because of the change that the board that reviews these kind of research projects and these concepts around this topic area have also made some recent meetings too. So it might be a little bit of both.
I hear you. Yeah, I'm probably willing to give them less of benefit of the doubt, but maybe I should. It's just that over the course of the pandemic, and this is where there's been a turn on Anthony Fauci, which I'm curious and kind of want to hear your take on. And there's other stuff here that we could hit on him too, that I might get to. But if people don't trust the establishment, if they don't trust the information coming from the establishment, and that would include, okay, wait, was the NIH funding this research or weren't they? And then it turns out that they actually were. That was, of course, what we were talking about late last week. The changing of the definition, again, if I take the bad faith approach, it starts to look like, wait, this is just an institution filled with bureaucrats who are trying to cover their butts after they make mistakes and then are afraid of getting caught having made them. And I don't allege anything more sinister than that. Some people are going, oh, this is a bioweapon, or oh, the United States developed this thing in Fort Detrick. There are people who are like that far, and I'm not going anywhere near that far because I genuinely don't believe that. I don't see any real signs of that, but. It seems like they have made mistakes. They've tried to cover their butts. It makes perfect sense that they would. And it seems like that's what we're watching right now. Again, I want to come back to Fauci. Have you seen the beagle thing? The story about like the research on beagles, dogs, which I know that animal experimentation, there's an active ethical debate over the use of animals, but this is coming out in a big way. It has to do with Fauci and the NIH funding this stuff. Have you seen that, Dr. Ellinger?
Oh, yeah, so read that. It's a common, almost a periodic time point every year you can kind of see those articles pop up is when people have access to that data. And then the other, getting back to your comment about this being, this is clearly, again, as we've said before, this is not something that was contrived or thought of in a nefarious manner. It's, from what we can tell, this is an organism that probably will be found in some type of natural host at some point. It took us many years to figure out where SARS-1 came from, and we'll be able to make the links at that point. Now, could it have been a biosafety kind of failure? Yes, it could have been that. And we've had that happen. It happens in our labs in the U.S. We have to it's a constant, diligent effort to make sure these things don't happen. And really, complacency is the thing that kills this process, is because in high containment labs, people become complacent. So we teach people to not become complacent over time. Overall, I mean, it's unfortunate, but again, the volume of work that goes on in a lab, I mean, I was looking at some of the numbers. I mean, 15,000 samples were collected at Wuhan of bat samples that were taken in. So we don't have 15,000 samples of viruses that have been sequenced. So there's a chance that there's always something hidden in that list of samples that are there that we don't know about. And so over time, we'll learn more about that. But yeah, I've read the Beagle story. Again, it's a story where if you want to make it sound horrible, it sounds horrible. Everybody loves beagles. I'm an animal lover myself. But at the end of the day, we have to do research, and animal models are kind of the unfortunate reality that we have to consider at this point. I'm looking for every day for ways to not use animals in studies to figure out, how to move science forward. But most of the time we do have to use animals. And that disease that was being tested in puppies, as it was written, was being done to save, basically it's a horrible disease that, a million people around the world have every year. And so it's a disease that's relevant, and it needs to be researched. And this is the model that's used. And I can tell you, any animal study that's done in the U.S. at this point is under so much scrutiny from both, industry, the animal use and care, which is run by veterinarians, basically is looking at this and saying, hey, let's make sure this is safe and sound. The research is being done. Let's try to do it with the least impact on the animal and least distress. So, again, and of course, the Public Health Service of the FDA and the NIH and Health and Human Services have really, really strict requirements around this. Some argue stricter requirements than human use studies, which are pretty high as well. So, it's something that's unfortunate to have to use animals, but you can make a really sad story about any animal that's suffering, and unfortunately, that's what research does at the moment.
Okay, just so I'm clear though, it sounds like you're saying we don't have all of the information. We don't have all the information available to know whether or not the molecular impossibility. Meaning, yes, from what we know that sequence, it seems to be impossible that this was the exact same virus. However, we don't have all of the sequencing for everything that they were doing in the lab because they were doing so much. So it's impossible to know, based on what we have now, on whether or not this did escape from the lab. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a fair assessment. And again, I mean, when they were doing a lot of the sampling that they were doing, they were going to places where people were actually reporting illness amongst humans that had been working in those or near those locations. So there was a high chance that they'd find something that was human. It could infect a human. So it's you got 15,000 samples. It's a lot of samples to go through, and that's several years ago. So it's probably quite a few more samples than that these days.
Wow. Okay.
400 new coronaviruses during that process.
Wow. Dr. Jean, thank you for this. We always appreciate you coming on to the show and adding your expertise to it. It undermines credibility, that's all. And, I'm one of those people who've been very strong on this notion of scientific research, scientific progress, et cetera. And then when you have the NIH basically coming out and gutting the knees from itself, it doesn't necessarily look good. And so I do appreciate you coming on and explaining the reality of this stuff. The voice that you guys were listening to is Dr. Gene Ollinger. He's a professor at Boston University, the principal science advisor for MRI Global, Inc., and recipient of the NIH Director Award in 2015 for his efforts assisting with the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa. He has also conducted and supervised in vitro and in vivo experiments in maximum biocontainment, focusing on high-consequence pathogens and biodefense. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means, at the very least, strongly implies, more likely than not, you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Great conversation with Dr. Gene Ollinger. I always enjoy those conversations.
It is, although I'm completely above board with this stuff. I felt like he was running a little bit of block for the NIH there, just like a little bit, bit. I felt like he was fessing up to some of the stuff, but Fauci seemed like he was lying there. And I'm not saying like we were talking. I'm just kind of repeating what we were saying over the break before we go into headlines.
And by the way, Fauci recently, when asked about this, and after admitting that they were doing gain of function. And, Rand Paul was being interviewed. It was like, Fauci can't be trusted and everything else. Fauci basically comes back and says, look, I didn't lie. I stand by the comments that I made prior. And what he's doing, it seems like, is he's merging those two items of saying, well, we're not responsible for the 4 million dead. It's like, yeah, buddy, but you were doing the gain of function.
We're doing the gain of function research. And whether it's gain of function or gain of function, or I don't know.
Yeah,
it's like the minutest difference. Exactly, and the minutest difference, like that he just came up with to be like, well, no, it's not. It's like, well, no, here's a new definition. That's what it feels like with the change on the website. Here's a new definition.
At the exact moment when we were caught.
At the exact moment when you came to realize that we were responsible for the previous definition. Now we have a new definition that means we're not responsible.
Yeah.
That's the moving the goalposts kind of thing.
Yeah, it's very, very strange.
Yeah.
People have said, I've defended Fauci on his noble lie about the mask stuff, where it was like, well, we need these people to have masks. We need to. Yeah, you didn't. You're like, yeah, screw that. You shouldn't have ever said it. But at this point, Fauci has lied like 3 or 4 times that I've pointed out. Like, even as a point on the show, I think I've even made mention where I was like, oh, dude, why are you lying about that?
And you know what comes really quick? Is when the leader, whoever, all true believers who are like, well, we should support the leader because we're going through a crisis right now. When it's like preference falsification or something. It's pretty close to that. When their perspective starts to shift and the people who are supporting the main person in charge suddenly realize that everybody's sort of losing support, then they jump ship.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, overnight, you don't even realize it until a couple of weeks later when you think back. It's like, oh, wait. A couple weeks ago, they were all defending this guy. Now they've all abandoned him. That's how that works. It happens so quickly.
Yeah, you can't.
I see that shift right now with Fauci. I can see that happening.
You just can't keep putting yourself in a situation where it seems like you're being dishonest for political effect.
No.
Where it's like, okay, I'm tweaking this because I think I can get the public to do X or Y.
And that's why,
man, that is the worst.
The bad faith interpretation. I'm trying to be above board with my biases, but the bad faith. Okay, I'm gonna read this move.
That's not bad faith. But he said as much.
But the idea that they changed the definition at that time, I'm reading in a motivation there, as are so many people watching this. It gets more and more justified to make that assumption because of everything else they've done in the past. They are digging their own grave with this stuff, and it becomes easier and easier to assume that they're acting in bad faith as they keep lying and screwing up. It becomes more reasonable to trust them less, is my point.
At the point where they're seemingly, because what it sounds like is that Eco Alliance didn't get across just by what the NHS said, that you didn't tell us that you were doing experimentation that could lead to this kind of gain-of-function research. Okay, even if we accept that, turn it around, because it makes it sound like maybe they weren't using the level of biocontainment necessary in order for them to do this type of research. And if that's true, and then they change the definition of something that explicitly excludes biosafety, biosecurity risk, carefully managed, etc. If they take all of that out and you find out that, okay, well, they weren't doing research in this high level of containment, that looks very suspicious. I mean, to put it mildly, that looks conspicuously suspicious. But we have headlines. Let's go to headlines. Great conversation. I do appreciate him. I do appreciate him coming on and giving us an explanation of it. Because like you said, he's typically honest with that stuff. You have some people who would have never even admitted, well, yeah, we don't have all of the information sequence where we would know as a flat fact that this wasn't coming from the lab and everything else. And unfortunately, Fauci, doesn't get the benefit of the doubt in saying this is molecularly impossible. when, again, we don't even know because we haven't necessarily sequenced each and every one of the things that they were doing in that lab.
Yeah.
So I appreciate Ollinger even explaining that part and getting into the details of what that means and so forth.
Well, but again, when he's, I'm not going to hit Ollinger on this. I'll hit Fauci. He says that it's molecularly impossible. They don't know that, right? Because they haven't analyzed all the sequences.
But that's my point, and that's what I'm saying. Ollinger gets credit on that for explaining that, or saying
he explained it, but he still defended him a little bit. He was like, no, he's not exactly lying there. He gets it mostly right. He's not.
Yeah.
Fauci's not. Fauci's overstating it to make his point stronger rhetorically as a political figure. But
I put it this way.
it's a dishonest.
I appreciate Ollinger explaining it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, 100%,
without even that explanation, we wouldn't even been getting to the point of saying Fauci's not necessarily been.
No, and I like him. I'm not even trying to hit him too hard.
Yeah.
It's just, because I've praised him very strongly when we've had him on before, and he's obviously very knowledgeable. You'd expect that, of course, but he's also easy to talk to, a good guy.
Absolutely.
I'm not trying to hit him too hard. I'm going to try to be balanced with this stuff.
Let's get to the headlines. In the news. Yesterday, in the United States, there were 105,561 new COVID cases. Now, I think if we go to the headline the day before, because I always like to point out that on Mondays, for whatever reason, the number is lower. 17,102 cases on Monday. Today, 105,561. I don't know what it is with the reporting over the weekend, but the number just drops. It's just always weird to me. Nevertheless, 105,561 new COVID cases reported with 1,414 deaths. Yesterday was 148 deaths. I never trust that Monday number. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 70,291 cases per day, a decrease of 22% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 57% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 66% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 45,528,926 people across the United States and has killed a greatly unfortunate 737,526 people, many of which are parents, many of which have kids. I wonder, are they including in that one shot people who got the one-shot vaccine? I can't think of the name of it.
Johnson & Johnson?
Yeah, right, exactly.
You mean the statistic of the one I've wondered that many times.
Because that's always weird to me.
Yes.
It's like the person gets one, it's like, yeah, I'm done.
Exactly. That's a lot of people. That's the point, is it's like almost 10%. What's the difference?
It's a big difference. It's like a 10% difference.
Exactly. It is a 9% difference, and that's 9% of Americans. That's like 30 million Americans right there.
Enough to get one.
Tens of millions of people.
To get two.
Yeah, it's just weird.
Yeah, I wonder if that part of that is Johnson & Johnson.
Yeah, it might be. Hopefully. But then you'd hope if it were Johnson & Johnson, they wouldn't confuse us by having the two separate stats.
All right, let's keep going. The FDA, that goes to Fauci again, where
it's all Fauci's fault.
Where Fauci had made this point about saying, okay, we need 75%. I think he said herd immunity or something. And then later he admitted that I thought I could goose the numbers up by changing the numbers. It's like, you did what?
Oh, yeah. That's when you turned on him.
Well, because it comes across as he was being dishonest. Yeah, and I don't like the dishonesty thing. I don't like it when the administration gooses the numbers and pretends that the number of people who are spreading it after they're getting vaccinated isn't what it is. I hate that stuff.
I hear you.
I want that stuff to be honest and above board.
The producers are cueing me
to keep going. My bad.
Keep going, because we just started headlines. We got some more to get through.
My bad. All right, let's keep going. The FDA advisory panel is meeting today to discuss vaccine shots for kids aged 5 through 11. The panel agrees that the shot is benefit. The FDA will choose to authorize it or not. The issue gets booted to the CDC for their input. If approved, schools could begin asking parents to vaccinate their kids before returning to class. In national youth news, yesterday 2 people were killed and 4 others, I suppose this means injured, including a police officer, were injured in a shooting at a mall in Boise, Idaho. Details are sketchy, but the initial briefing by the police stated that they responded to a call of an incident. When police arrived, they engaged the suspect, which led to an exchange of gunfire, injuring one officer and taking the suspect into custody. Governor Ron DeSantis is planning to offer $5,000 bonuses for police officers who refuse the vaccine in order to relocate to Florida. He wants a bunch of unvaccinated cops. Good job. In international news, pro-democracy protesters in Sudan blocked roadways with makeshift barriers, burning tires, and placing their obstructions to show their displeasure with a coup that occurred yesterday. The United Nations Security Council is set to discuss the details of Sudan in a closed-door meeting today. At least 3 people are dead as a result of the fighting yesterday, and another 140 are confirmed wounded. Continuing in international news, Russia's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova has condemned statements made by Germany's caretaker defense minister saying that Moscow should be aware that Germany would use nuclear deterrence against Russia if it were to attack a NATO member. The Kawa described this statement as, I don't know what the UN means, but I would imagine she described it as unfortunate. A UN report this Monday detailing the status of North Korea, worrying of a, quote, human rights and humanitarian situation, unquote, is being rejected by the country. North Korean media and organizations are calling the report malicious slander and, quote, part of a U.S.-backed scheme to interfere with the internal affairs of other countries, unquote. Europol has seized millions of euros worth of cash and Bitcoin and arrested 150 suspects involved in the dark web, a shadowy community of covert servers and web networks. Agents working with Operation Dark Hunter successfully confiscated 26.7 million euros and about 31 million worth of cash and virtual currencies, along with 45 guns, 516 pounds of drugs, including 25,000 ecstasy pills. That is unfortunate for the ecstasy pills. Hunger has risen to such extents in Afghanistan that parents are resolving to sell their children into marriages to afford food. Fahima is in such a situation, about to give up her daughters for a marriage deal. Her daughters are 6 years old, which is $3,350, and 18 months old, which is a little bit less, I suppose, because of her age is less, $2,800. The father has already made the agreement with two wealthy Afghans, stating they will all die if they do not go through with the sale. God, that's unfortunate. In Earth and Science news, a massive bomb cyclone that hit the West Coast, knocking out power of around 250,000 buildings, is moving east, ripping through the east. New York and New Jersey have already declared a state of emergency. As of this morning, the storm could prevent people from going to work in New England. Expect 3 to 5 inches of rain per day over the next couple of days if you live in the Northeast. In business news, a rumor circulating on Twitter that John Gruden is claiming that Jeff Bezos is nearing a deal to buy Washington football team, as Diane Snyder is being forced to sell. Reports of Bezos eyeing NFL ownership dates back all the way to 2018. And in holiday news, it is Worldwide Howl at the Moon Night, basically Wolf Night, and National Pumpkin Day. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. My dog always comes down Pitsu. I don't sleep well at night. And so 2 in the morning, inevitably, he comes downstairs and is looking at me like, take me out, take me out. And he hates the rain, hates it with a passion. And he goes to the door, he's whining. I was like, all right, come on. He opened the door and it is pouring down. He looks outside and just goes the opposite way. And at this point, my wife is coming down. It's like, no, buddy, you're going out, you're going out, you're going out. He hates it. I didn't realize that the storm was moving through, but that kind of explains why it was pouring down like, bananas.
It's been heavy,
night.
but that's also just been happening. The weird thing is the idea that like a bomb cyclone, this meteorological phenomenon.
The name of it is so weird.
Well, that it like travels across the entire continent or whatever. It travels apparently from the West Coast across the northern part to the East Coast. And again, it's just swept, which is just,
Why did they call it a bomb cyclone?
I was actually looking into this because it's the kind of thing people look into every couple of years when we hear about one. Bomb cyclone, explosive cyclogenesis, the rapid deepening of an extratropical cyclonic low pressure area. So it's when an area gets super low pressure above the tropics in the northern hemisphere.
The bomb thing's really...
It's extremely low pressure.
Yeah, it just jumps out at you.
It just jumps.
Cyclone.
Yeah.
And I've never heard of the term before. That's my first time ever hearing the term. Yeah.
I've heard this way. Again, every couple of years, I think this one comes around. I remember this.
Bomb cyclone.
But I'm interested in the weather. Weather is just trippy stuff in general.
Weather is interesting.
Yeah.
I remember they were trying to use bombs, like weather bombs, like, we're trying to get a tornado over an enemy area where at that point you can say, we don't have anything to do with that.
The first intercontinental ballistic missiles? You familiar with these guys? These would have been World War I.
You mean the Second World War, where Germany was basically bombing England?
I'm trying to remember the exact time frame of these. I know some of the specific facts, but basically,
Werner von Braun. If I'm not mistaken.
No, it's before that. This would have been. Just trying to remember, it was Japan with these hot air weather balloons that they were launching to the United States in order to try to, Fugu balloon bombs Mark Sloboda, by the way, who's on the line, would be familiar with this, I'm sure. A weapon launched by Japan during World War II. Again, you got to think intercontinental ballistic missiles, rocketry. Although,
well, see, when I think of rocketry, I think of Germany bombing England with their terror bombs.
But that's Germany and England right across the channel from each other. Practically, that's so close. I'm talking intercontinental. I'm talking many thousands of miles away. Japan launched all these balloon bombs that were basically loaded with munitions. But you think about it, a hot air balloon. For one thing, it's traveling slowly. And for another thing, these are unmanned. So they're just sort of launching these things to drift over the Pacific Ocean to the United States.
Though.
And they only killed a couple people or something like that. But they were in use. And sadly, those people were Americans. It's not, nothing to...
Yeah, I wouldn't call those missiles, but I get your point. I mean, it's the first intercontinental ballistic bomb or something.
Yeah,
it just sounds funny.
Exactly.
Like a slow-moving hot air balloon bomb.
It's one of those trivia pieces. It's just an interesting piece of like, okay, that was something that people tried out. And there's some promise there. I see kind of what they're thinking, but the technology just wasn't around.
Well, the wild part is Japan and the Air Force, and we need to get out, but Japan was one of those places that saw the value of the Air Force early on. We were doing, I believe it was the U.S. was doing testing on airplanes. Some of the people in the military was like, it's a fad. We don't see anything about it. Japan was like, that is a great idea, and that is going to come in handy.
They had the Zero, their fighter plane, the whole kamikaze thing, of course. It was partly because of the cheap, mass production of these planes.
Yeah, and they were willing to give their lives. There was a joke about, it's like, how does a kamikaze fighter get out alive? Like, because some of the people basically lived, and Larry David was making this kind of joke about, like, you did a horrible job, buddy.
You failed. That gets grim pretty quickly. Oh, God, you start making those jokes about suicide bombers. Yeah. That's real rough.
All right, guys. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment with the one and only Mark Sloboda. Back shortly.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Mark Sloboda. We're joined now by our guest, Mark Sloboda, frequent guest on the show. Great one, in fact. Great having you. Mark, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Shane, Jamarl, thanks for having me on. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the critic.
What?
How dare you, sir? Other shows, Mark.
How dare you?
No, I'm just kidding.
Fault Lines?
It's Fault Lines. Yeah, that different time slot. There you go. You got it. We're still your favorites, right, Mark? You're not. No, I'm just kidding. No, we're making it happen.
Hey, you guys are always the most fun.
Good to hear it. I believe it. Mark Sloboda, thank you for joining us. I appreciate you saying that. So you got to do something to bomb the wounds. Anyway, no. Mark, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. International Relations and Security Analyst for those folks listening. You can find him, by the way, on Twitter. Mark Sloboda1. That's the number 1 on Twitter. Mark, got a bunch to talk about this morning. I'm going to start with Sudan, actually. I want to talk about recent diplomatic back and forth between Germany and Russia over nuclear deterrence. It's the claim, but get into the specifics there. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It seems just like a sort of provocation thing. But Sudan first, just because that's big news, and we like to talk to you about geopolitics in general. Admittedly, we usually like to talk to you about these sort of, I don't know, Eurasian geopolitical axis and weapons developments, things like that. But we're turning to East Africa at this point, East North Africa in the case of Sudan. A coup taking place in the country yesterday. Just briefly, what do you see happening in this situation? What do you think, for outside observers looking at this, okay, it's a coup in an African country. What do you think they should know about it more than that?
Okay, so Sudan, roughly 3 years ago, with U.S. assistance, a 3-decade military dictator, Omar al-Bashir, who largely led the country into independence from colonial rule. He was deposed by protests, and since then the country has been run by a transition government, by a sovereignty council, which included both military and civilian leaders. However, since then, things have gotten very unstable in the country. Through a series of neoliberal shock therapy, IMF prescriptions and loans, the IMF described their plan for the country as to open the currency to the free market, increase state revenues, and decrease subsidies, which means that the currency lost about 1,000% of its value. They raised taxes on the poorest, and they ended subsidies, which had provided a lifeline to a great deal of the population. Sudan is a very poor country in a very important geopolitical strategic situation that has the ability to cut off access to the Red Sea and thus to the Suez Canal. There are rival protests in the country in recent months between people who support the civilian side of this transition government and also large protests by large numbers of people that want to see the military restore order and economic stability to the country. Its critics are calling the transition government led by the civilians as the hunger government. This has been exacerbated by big floods in the country, the pandemic crisis, and recently we saw pro-military, a tribe, there's a lot of tribal politics in Sudan, block off access to the port, leading to further economic crisis, demanding that the military restore order to the country. There was an aborted coup just over a month ago by some lower-rank military officers, but now this seems to have been done at the top. This is the head of the Security Council, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and he has imprisoned the quote-unquote prime minister, Abdallah Hamdok. No one knows where he is at this point. And he's made it quite clear that the military is taking over, though he's still promising to lead a transition to democracy and that there will be elections on schedule in 2023. This is a very important country. Again, geopolitically, China had long had a lot of interests in Sudan and Africa, particularly under the previous leader, al-Bashir. And Russia had been in negotiations with Sudan to open a naval base there, a Navy logistics center for a lot of its anti-piracy activities in the Red Sea area. Russia actually just stopped another attempted piracy of a container ship there in the past 24 hours. And the U.S., of course, would like to have blocked both of those, and they have been flooding the country with people, economic advisors, promises of aid. They've removed sanctions. But they also promised to reorganize the military along U.S. lines, which probably didn't go over well with a lot of the people sitting in the military at this point. And they seem to have had enough and have overthrown the government, just in the last 48 hours.
Very interesting. So basically the coup is being driven by the economic chaos, the food shortage or the food crisis, and also this kind of pressure on the military from external forces that are basically trying to reorganize it in the frame of the U.S. interests. That's what I got from that.
That is a great deal of it, I would say. Certainly, the hunger, the economic problems is a lot of what is driving the people on the street in the hundreds of thousands, Khartoum and elsewhere in the country.
That makes sense. Also, another thing you said, Mark. Well, you're trying to add something in there. Go for it. What were you going to say?
Yeah, it's a mess. That's my high level analysis.
That is a pretty good, useful summary, and that does make sense in terms of the coup happening. You said reorganizing the military along U.S. lines. I'm just curious, broadly what you mean. You know, we got a bunch of other stuff to talk about, so I don't need just broadly. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, that would be, you know, like they would purge everyone from the ranks who didn't agree with the geopolitical reorientation of the country towards the U.S. and its allies. That would be the start of it. Then the military does have a lot of, shall we say, economic benefits where a lot like Egypt and surrounding countries, the military actually runs large portions of the economy. And of course, there is corruption there as well. They would seek to end that and create a whole new line of corruption and, of course, increase U.S. arms sales in the way. But it would also involve sending a large number of officers to the U.S. and other NATO countries for training.
Is this a noble takeover? And I'm using the term noble takeover kind of like a noble lie. Yeah. But is this the military doing kind of like, okay, this is in the best interest of the country in order to bring down hostility, in order to ensure the economy gets on the right footing, et cetera, et cetera? Or is this purely out of self-interest, or is there some kind of middle ground between those things?
People ask about a good shoot or a bad shoot. It sounds like you're asking about, is this a good coup or a bad coup almost tomorrow?
Pretty much, yeah.
I would try to drop that Manichaean viewpoint. I'm sure there are people in the military and lots of their supporters that see it as a good thing. And I'm sure there are lots of people that support the Forces of Freedom and Change coalition, which has backed the civilian government, although they've actually seen a split recently with part of their forces now actually backing the military. But, you know, there are different interests. There are different geopolitical interests. There are different domestic interests, there are different economic interests, there are different tribal interests, and they all are playing out. And I don't think you should really look is there a good side or is there a bad side? It's just, does your country have certain interests in Sudan, and do they benefit or not benefit from what has happened?
Oh, and then another question here, the U.S., do you think that the U.S. is in a mood right now? It sounds like this is partly driven as a response. Specifically, you're talking about the modernization of the military is one way to put it, or the westernization, whichever way, whatever. The idea that they're reworking that stuff. Is the U.S. going to come in and try to intervene and end the coup to extend their influence and, make sure that process keeps going, the modernization, westernization, that whole thing?
Yeah, I don't think that Sudan is one of those countries that the U.S. is eager to militarily intervene again. If they intervene again, they've already cut off aid to the country. You might notice that Samantha Powers has recently been in the country. She's now in charge of the U.S. aid program, which often doubles as interests for the Central Intelligence Agency. I think you would see intervention more on the lines of, on the intelligence side, backing of certain political forces in the country with money and organizational ability, and then with renewed sanctions if they feel necessary, which would be devastating.
Yes. Yeah, well, especially after having been supported, and, she, the head of USAID, United States Agency for International Development, I hadn't even realized, but you're right, holding press conferences over the course of the year, announcing, donations or whatever you want to put it, money, aid for like election-related assistance, whatever that means. And the point is, if that gets cut off, it reminds me of another situation, of course, that I want to turn to briefly, that of Afghanistan, where in the headlines this morning, we have it as some parents are selling their kids into early marriages as infants in order to be able to afford food. Because Afghanistan, of course, under the Taliban right now, just a couple of months into a new government, is facing widespread poverty, economic deprivation, that whole thing. And that's partly because of a drop-off in donations, basically, from other countries, from humanitarian aid, but also partly because the investment deals that the Taliban seem to be hoping to sign with China haven't come through, yet. It's not been that long, I suppose. What do you see happening next? I mean, again, the headline we read this morning is pretty stark. Parents having to sell their infant children into early marriages in order to be able to afford the daily bread. That's about as bad as it gets, although it could get worse. What do you see coming, Mark?
Okay, well, first of all, you have to keep in mind that that's actually a practice that has been done in Afghanistan for the last 40-plus years of civil conflict, and that's nothing new. I mean, that has been happening during the last 20 years of U.S. military occupation of the country as well.
Thank you for the correction.
I mean, headlines like that really, I mean, they grip you. They're visceral and emotional, but you have to realize that that's been the life of the Afghan people for half a century now, unfortunately, in a lot of situations. But the economic situation does look dire. Part of that is the U.S. has seized the country's financial reserves, which they kept for it in safekeeping, and the government now run by the Taliban is facing renewed sanctions on the country, which will, make a lot of foreign companies that might be interested, like Chinese, hesitate before subjecting themselves to the brutal hammer of U.S. sanctions. Plus there are still negotiations with the government by both China, Russia, and other countries about what the form of that government looks like, its relations with its neighbors, how it's going to run the country. Things are still all up in the air. But whatever way you slice it, the Taliban takeover and the U.S. withdrawal from the country is going to lead to some economic hard times in the country. Not that they've had any good times, but the U.S. Drain spigot has been shut off of money and aid into the country, and on top of that, they've seized the reserves, and now sanctions will start to come into effect. So it's going to get worse.
Oh, that is not. That's grim, to put it mildly.
Yeah, the Russian government, says there is, an almost inevitable humanitarian catastrophe, much more so than before, even on the horizon.
Let me ask you this. One more question about Sudan before we move on. The African Union has basically, I think we went through this yesterday, where the African Union pushed Sudan out of the African Union. Are the countries in the area going to have any kind of political influence on, I guess you could say, stability, or for that matter, getting the military to give up its control of the government?
Sure. I mean, the African Union itself has, of course, called for the restoration, the release of the prime minister, the resurrection of dialogue, and a return to the transitional council government between the military and the new civilian leaders of the country. But yeah, certainly the biggest, perhaps, neighboring country that's going to have an influence is Egypt, which saw, if you'll remember, civilian rule overturned after the events of the Arab Spring, and a military dictator come to power there and eventually be accepted by the U.S. and the rest of the world there. And that might be play an outsized interest in what happens in Sudan as well. Kind of a knock-on effect. So I would not be surprised to see this military coup become a restoration of military rule.
Mm-hmm. And it's certainly not going to, as a kind of small note maybe, but something we were talking about earlier on in the year, certainly not going to help the talks over the Ethiopian dam, and the whole conversation about dealing with the Nile River as it flows in that direction. Anyway, Sudan in crisis, basically Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia, have been installed talks for a very long time at this point. It's not going to help. The complete overthrow of one of those governments is certainly going to slow that down.
And it has been noticed that each of those three governments has their own destabilizing internal affairs that are taking priority over just about anything else right now.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, let's turn. I wanted to turn because we got a couple more things to talk about you with. I want to talk about Germany and Russia. We also wanted to go to Biden a little bit more. Well, it's international, but Biden in a recent town hall, I don't know if you saw this, basically saying that the United States would stand with Taiwan militarily, would come to Taiwan's aid militarily. I want to come back to that. But first, Germany and Russia, sort of war of words going on right now, with Russia's Foreign Minister Maria Zakharova criticizing Germany, calling statements an official theirs had made unacceptable after Germany said that if Russia were to invade a NATO member country, Germany would respond with nuclear deterrence. Germany would respond nuclearly, which, frankly, I guess as a point of clarification, good to know maybe, but also seems like a provocation. It seems like the kind of thing that they're saying, again, just to provoke, just to maybe escalate tensions. That's how I see it. How do you see this, Mark? What do you think about what they're saying? What does this mean? Why is it happening right now?
Yeah. The statements were actually a little bit more provocative than that and didn't even necessarily deal with a direct Russian invasion. The comments were by the German Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. It has to be said that she is on her way out with the rest of Angela Merkel's government, and there are questions about whether she'll be able to retain her parliamentary seat. So there may be a big domestic element to her making provocative statements and trying to, come in on the top of the headlines as pushing against Russia. She is one of the biggest champions of NATO among German politicians, and she was one of the big ones pushing just in the last week. NATO released a new strategy grand plan on defense and deterrence in the Euro-Atlantic area, meaning against Russia. And it's basically talking about expanding the conflict in the area of confrontation into the Black Sea, as well as the Baltic area, and elements of cyber, nuclear deterrence, and other elements of warfare there, other than just the conventional. And she was speaking about this new. It's still large. The details are kept secret, classified, even as they're making a big deal out of it. She was speaking on a German radio station, and she said, in order to deter Russia, it might be necessary to deploy nuclear weapons in the air above the Baltic states, which is a really bizarre thing, like nuclear fireworks. Is that really what she meant to say going off there? It wasn't clear. Her statements were not clear. And they have been challenged within Germany. The head of the parliamentary Social Democratic Party, which is part of the coalition government, has condemned her comments as being needlessly provocative. Certainly Russia summoned the German embassy's military attaché and expressed their concern. Sergei, Shoigu talked about, that NATO is talking about deterring Russia with nuclear weapons as it's building up troops on Russia's borders. And he said, multiple areas. But he said that, that this German defense minister, she might want to remember the last time that Germany was building up troops on Russia's borders and how well that went for them, obviously evoking the specter of World War II. Yeah. Has to be remembered that Germany doesn't have any nuclear weapons. France does.
I was wondering that.
The UK outside of the EU does, but there are about 150 U.S. nuclear weapons. The not so secret in Europe, the majority of those in Germany. So it's not clear what exactly nuclear weapons she was talking about using in the skies above the Baltics to deter Russia. Not that Russia has made any moves in the last, since 1992 towards challenging, not one shot fired in the Baltics direction, despite continual, advancement of NATO closer to Russia's borders. So this seems to be more bluster and provocation, creating of Cold War attitudes, largely for a lot of domestic reasons, unfortunately.
Yeah, because when I read this, I thought, Germany has nuclear weapons? I didn't think Germany had nuclear weapons. So, yeah.
She was talking about NATO.
Yeah,
at that point. We can presume that she was talking about allies because her own country doesn't have it.
Well, one thing about the nuclear weapons in the sky, I mean, this is something that I've always been concerned about, new technology where you can have this kind of global domination by using exotic technologies over in space, or this idea that you can have something that's sliding across the atmosphere where you can drop kinetic bombs, or in this case, I guess she's talking about some kind of nuclear weapon from some high height, or having that thing basically perched as a sword of Damocles over various governments. I mean, that's disturbing, to put it mildly. And for her to even to bring that up, saying we need to have nuclear weapons in the sky.
Well, it's really got to be like that, or like bombers that are carrying it. I'm talking about
just like flying
bombers
around,
that are carrying it for some reason.
I think more traditional means is.
Yeah.
Like just basically, but
or
fireworks, some kind of weapon platform in space, or some kind of weapons platform in the sky.
But
that doesn't make sense.
As far as I know, that doesn't exist with nukes, right?
Yeah, I think the lack of sense in her comments, both in the sense of the provocation and the actuality of what she was even talking about, is a good indication of her incompetence in the role of defense minister, and not a surprise that she's on the way out and probably won't be back in a similar role or possibly any other role in the near time.
Anytime soon. That's fair. Let's go to Taiwan for a moment because, we've had this conversation about how invested is the United States in Taiwan, and how many dead Americans is the United States willing to accept in order to defend Taiwan. And I'm skeptical that they could even do that just because of the proximity of Taiwan to China. But Joe Biden was asked this at a scripted town hall, and I want to emphasize scripted because everything that was basically asking that he knew in advance. And yet, despite knowing in advance, despite not being taken off guard, he had this prepared answer for it. Let's play this clip.
China just tested a hypersonic missile. What will you do to keep up with them militarily, and can you vow to protect Taiwan?
Yes and yes. We are militarily, China, Russia, and the rest of the world knows we have the most powerful military in history of the world. Don't worry about whether they're going to be more powerful. What you do have to worry about is whether or not they're going to engage in activities that will put them in a position where they may make a serious mistake. And so I have spoken and spent more time with Xi Jinping than any other world leader has. That's why you hear people saying Biden wants to start a new Cold War with China. I don't want a Cold War with China. I just want to make China understand that we are not going to step back. We are not going to change any of our views.
So are you saying that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense if China attacked?
Yes, we have a commitment.
Yes, we have a commitment. And I love the point. He says Biden is trying to start a new Cold War, which gets across this kind of message of who is the aggressor here and who's the one who's basically making the provocative moves and actions. Is this just bluster and bravado, or is he seriously talking about basically starting a nuclear war with China over Taiwan?
Yeah, so it might be noted that after Biden made these comments, presumably off script in a supposedly scripted, entirely scripted affair, and he said that the U.S. would come to Taiwan's aid unequivocally, the White House quickly walked back his remarks with the presidential spokesman clarifying to the press later that there has been no change in official U.S. policy on Taiwan. And if you have a question about what official U.S. policy is on Taiwan, it's governed by the Taiwan Relations Act ratified by Congress in '79, which is it is entirely crafted to be deliberately, strategically, completely ambiguous. And it says the U.S. will make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability. And you can see there's a big difference between that and Biden promising to send U.S. Young military boys and girls in uniform off to die to separate Taiwan from China, because the U.S. government actually does recognize that Taiwan is part of China, and supporting separatism there would definitely provoke a war. And this is exactly the type of comments that are the red line that are, China says would provoke it to military action. And it's rather funny how quickly the Biden administration walked back their own ostensible leaders' comments about this and saying, no, we didn't actually change anything. Just kind of scrub all that.
Why do you think he did it?
Because you could say that he's again being deliberately provocative in an ambiguous way, but I honestly think that he is not completely aware of the nuance of his own country's foreign policy, ambiguous line.
I don't know, because that's the thing. He would have to. I get that Biden's old at this point, but he would have to be aware. That's the whole backbone of our policy on this. Like you said, that whenever we talk about this, we talk about the strategic ambiguity, and this seemed to be a notable exception to that. And honestly, a clarifying one, maybe distressing in certain ways, but also the comfort of a certainty. There is a comfort. Okay, you know where we stand on this one. I don't necessarily think we should intervene in Taiwan. And again, that's like the three evils. China's sort of political slogan idea of what are the bad things in society. If you look at it, it's terrorism, religious extremism, and separatism, which is what we're talking about here. This is one of the last things they want. But again, Biden would know this is the backbone of American foreign policy. It seems like that exception has to be intentional, and it's timed just so, right? I mean, and maybe I don't know if it's coordinated. It seems like it wouldn't be, but he'd have to know it, right, Mark?
I think that there is a difference between the way that they may talk about Taiwan and what they may plan for Taiwan and what diplomatically is the official U.S. position on this ambiguity. And he may have lapsed into his own private conversational way of talking. Either way, he was either being extremely provocative or he was being incompetent. Neither one of those should be give you a warm fuzzy towards his performance in casual diplomatic discussion about China.
See, I took this as one of those things where he was being, bellicose intentionally with the idea that they were going to walk it back later, with the idea that it's for an American audience consumption. Kind of like when it's like, I looked into Putin's eyes and, the guy's a killer, but later, walked it back later. I took this to be the same way, this kind of bellicosity that Trump would do or that Biden often does, with the knowledge that nothing has fundamentally changed in regards to U.S. policy. However, when I talk to the American audience about it, I'm going to seem tough and ready to go. I'm, Joe Biden.
But two things, and yes, I kind of agree with you, but also playing devil's advocate with that one. But you got to realize they're going to read it too. The international audience is going to read it too. And I do like the idea that he knew they were going to walk it back, but still, it's a sort of shifting in that direction while maintaining the pretense that this isn't our official position.
Yeah, because even saying it has value. I mean, it has weight to it.
It has to be noted that the U.S. has been dropping a lot of trial balloons and deliberately moving that ambiguous position on Taiwan further and further, and we've seen it not just from the U.S., but like from Lithuania acting as a U.S. proxy and opening up a Taiwan representative office, in the name of the Republic of China and so on. There is every possibility that this is another, inching slide forward towards, some type of recognition of Taiwanese independence, which also is making China extremely uncomfortable.
We've got to go, and thank you for sticking with us for so long, Mark, just because we're a little bit over time, but I appreciate you sticking. There's another thing which happened so recently that I figure it would still be on everybody's minds, but hey, I'll reassert it anyway. With Afghanistan, Biden went against, from all appearances, what the Pentagon wanted and what a lot of his top advisors wanted. He had his own agenda there that he followed, which shows that on certain issues, Biden will do his own thing, which means that just adds a layer of evidence to what we see all happening here with the walk back and everything. Might not have been coordinated. It might have just been him taking that step and then different elements deciding, no, you can't do that, guy, that kind of thing. So, I know there are different sides to this. Mark, any last thoughts before we close out here?
Yeah, either his own element or Trump's, because this is exactly the foreign policy in both China and Afghanistan that Trump was pushing forward, if you'll remember.
It's true. It's true. Mark Sleboda, thank you for joining us this morning, afternoon your time. Great talking with you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Mark Sleboda, for those listening, international relations and security analyst. Follow him on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1, and that's the number 1. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Be back with you on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And we are now accepting your phone calls, at the very least for the next 10 minutes. The number is 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Starting off with Tarif from New Orleans. What's going on, Tarif? How's it going, man?
Thank y'all for taking my call. I got two comments. First, I'd like to say hashtag free Julian Assange, free Dong Zinger, and hands off Haiti. My first comment is dealing with Julian Assange. Stella Morris yesterday was quoted by Reuters News. They did an article quoting Stella Morris saying that Julian Assange, by the information coming out about the CIA kidnap plot, that's actually a game changer. And I'm glad that Reuters and Yahoo News printed that story yesterday.
And why did you think it's a game changer?
Because you had 30 people that came out and spoke to Yahoo News 2 weeks ago saying that it was what Mike Pompeo said, which is illegal. You know, that should hopefully affect the case where he shouldn't get extradited from a legal stance. He shouldn't, But, we know we got the deep state over him. They try to, control things on the other end. And also she said that he's sickly, he lost weight and stuff like that. He needs, health care, and he needs attention. He needs to be released. So we got to push for Julian Assange to be released.
I mean, he's basically been tortured in the public limelight for the past 7 years and then thrown into a prison after that during a COVID pandemic or during the COVID epidemic where people were being sick in those jails and whatnot. Not to mention the inability for him to have decent counsel with his lawyer and those type of things. And it's like on top of all of it, these guys were spying on him. And not just spying on him, now you hear Pompeo, these guys talking about let's find a way to basically breach the Ecuadorian embassy, breaking law, to put it mildly, and murder the guy, or for that matter, rendition the guy. Yeah, all this stuff is dark, to put it mildly, Tarif. What was your secondary comment, by the way?
Oh, yeah, yes, I agree. That is terrible what they're trying to do here. But second comment is dealing with the cargo containers. Again, I got 2 points to make with that. It's 150 ships that's trying to unload. But from what I read something, and it made kind of sense what I read. But it's going to take some years, though, for it to happen. That in my first point with my second comment is going to hopefully bring back, it should bring back U.S. manufacturers again, where we can start producing our own products. We can have a massive hiring of people, hopefully at decent raises. And also, believe it or not, it kind of by the Chinese exporting cheap goods, it hurts the middle class. But by the containers not being offloaded, what need to happen with China is that they need to start importing products inside their country where their own people can start paying for it. But the way they do it, they can't just pay people at, small rates or small wages. They need to boost up the payment, let the people organize with unions so they can get paid more money so they can afford the stuff they send it to the United States and Europe, so they can build up their middle class. You see what I'm saying? So in a way, it kind of is not really benefiting China because it's keeping their middle class down by exporting. But
I mean, that's not entirely true, Sharif. I mean, they're exporting to the United States, which is meaning the companies and the things. In fact, there was China's explicit plan on raising the economic output for their country. I mean, you have 200 million people that were brought out of poverty. Part of the way they were doing that is by basically being the exporter of the world.
And also, I think they've shifted out of that. And at this point, more goods are being produced in Indonesia, for instance. They've started to export to they've started to use other countries as their manufacturing centers too, as the middle class has grown.
Yeah.
Sharif.
Yeah, but for what I understand, that China need to create a higher, a middle class with a stronger income, with higher income.
But they have. That's what I'm saying, Tarif.
Well,
even the millionaire class or the billionaire class.
But this is also a conversation we've been having. And then there's also this conversation when you add to that, which is what happens when countries have a developing middle class? All of a sudden, the middle class starts placing political demands on the government. It's true. That's a conversation I remember having years ago and seeing people write about and stuff. Yeah. It's still happening now. But, I can hear both of you. And you're right, Tarif. I think that's part of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's an objective on some level. I mean, like I said, China ran into this problem that the United States has, basically that once you've opened up the economy, you have these kind of economic zones, you end up with billionaires. And lo and behold, they have this kind of wealth disparity there also that is also pretty aggressive. And the goal at that point is, okay, how do we make sure that the wealth is spread out in a way that's not necessarily isolated at the top? Because, look, just like what Shane said, at a point where you have these billionaires in a country, you get this notion of influence. And the questions that I've always had when we had some of the people here from China is like, how does China maintain, how does the Communist Party maintain their political power in the face of this kind of economic new elite of billionaires, whatnot?
But that would be the elite. Those are the upper class. Even the middle class. The idea with the middle class is that you get a bunch of middle class people who have time on their hands. They start attending universities. They start getting loftier ideas and start following ideologies, whatever. And then, okay, China, which is all about internal cultural stability, if not unity, how do they deal with that? How do they deal with the demands that would be placed on them by that new middle class? But then there's also what you're saying, which is, they have upper class people with a lot of consolidated power, this new oligarchy. How do they deal with the rise of oligarchy as a sort of parallel governance?
I get a feeling that culturally they're different than us. I mean, like, I'll give you an example. One of the things in the United States, I think they said like 93% of drivers believe that they drive above average, which is like, what? And I think in Japan, the number was far, far less, like where they believe that most of it was not as good.
On the other way.
Yeah, the other way. Some of that stuff comes to kind of cultural differences in the various countries.
We get another caller.
Yeah. Tarif, thanks, my man. We appreciate it.
Yeah, Tarif, thank you. We got David calling in. I appreciate it, Tarif. David calling in from NYC. David, you're on. What's going on?
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I have two comments, completely different comments, but the first one is a hypothetical platform instead of a publisher, a platform, and I'll name it, but I don't know if it could actually take hold of something like this. True free speech, where they advertise that if it's not illegal, you can say it. Firstly, could such a thing exist legally? If there was a true free speech platform where they allowed anything, okay, except illegal stuff. So, if there's no law against it, and that would be part of their motto. If it's not illegal, you can say it. What do you think about that idea? That's the first comment.
I mean, it depends. I mean, I know there's going to be certain things that fall into this notion of, okay, this is not technically illegal, but, this is kind of unethical. I don't know what the line is on that one. I don't know.
Well, there's a super obvious question here, which is valuable to ask, which is, wait, are Facebook and Twitter and these guys, are they legally bound to do any of the censorship stuff here, or is it all just over
like political pressure?
Overly heavy political pressure from politicians and the Democrats who are threatening antitrust suit? That's the assumption that I've been making, is that it's not like there are specific laws in the books that they're able to throw at them to be like, okay, in a lot of these cases, and maybe I'm forgetting something here, but. David, any other comments there?
Yeah, what's your second comment, David?
Completely different comment. I think, I don't know if I had his name right, but was your guest Professor Ollinger, was that his name?
Yes, Gene Ollinger.
Okay, yeah. Very credible, very, very valuable information. But I have to say, you pointed out also that he may have been doing a little bit of blocking. Hasn't he in the past, or even possibly in the present, recipient of NIH grants?
He was 2015 recipient of NIH Director's Award, but also last time we had him on, he was pretty critical, and so he's willing to do that stuff too. Which is, yeah, anyway, that's the info there. But yeah, you're right about that.
Criticize his own thing.
Yeah, exactly. He's willing to criticize the institution too, but we've got to go. David, thank you for the call. We're going into our last hour. Coming back in a minute with headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the infatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning again, folks. It's October 26th. It's just past 9 a.m. Eastern, and it's time now for our third batch of headlines this morning. Let's start with COVID stats. First up, yesterday in the United States, there were 105,561 new COVID cases reported. There were also 1,414 deaths, 1414 deaths. A lot of people dying. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 70,291 cases per day. That's a decrease of 22% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 57% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 66% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 45,528,926 people across the United States. It has killed 737,526 people. The FDA advisory panel is meeting today to discuss vaccine shots for kids aged 5 through 11. If the panel agrees the shot is a benefit to those kids, the FDA will choose to authorize it or not. Then the issue gets booted to the CDC for their input. If approved, schools could begin asking parents to vaccinate their children before those kids return to classes. In national news, yesterday, 2 people were killed and 4 others, including a police officer, were injured in a shooting at a mall in Boise, Idaho. Details are sketchy, but the initial briefing by the police stated they responded to a call at the incident. When police arrived, they engaged the suspect, which led to an exchange of gunfire, injuring one officer and taking the suspect into custody. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis is planning to offer $5,000 bonuses for police officers who refuse the vaccines to relocate to the state of Florida. In international news, pro-democracy protesters in Sudan blocked roadways with makeshift barriers. They burned tires and placed other obstructions to show their displeasure with the coup that occurred just yesterday in the country. The United Nations Security Council is set to discuss the details of Sudan in a closed-door meeting today. At least 3 people are dead as a result of the fighting yesterday. Another 140 have been confirmed wounded. Various governments have rescinded aid that had been due to Sudan, including the United States. The internet is down in the country as of today. A lot of stuff happening. Talked about this, by the way, with Mark Sloboda last hour. You're talking with him about it. 8:15 is when you can go check that out. Russia's foreign ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, has condemned statements made by Germany's caretaker defense minister, a person in charge while Merkel's still chancellor in her government. Maria Zakharova condemned statements made by that person, saying that Moscow should be aware that Germany would use nuclear deterrence against Russia if it were to attack a NATO member. It's a bit more complicated than that, like we got into it with Mark Sloboda just a few minutes ago, again, last hour. It has to do with this sort of confusing, ambiguous statement that Germany's defense minister said about having nukes over the seas in the Baltic, in the air. And we were speculating, as many were, about what exactly she could have meant by that. Anyway, Maria Zakharova described these statements as unacceptable. A UN report this month detailing the status of North Korea, worrying of a human rights and humanitarian situation, is being rejected by the country. North Korean media and organizations are calling their report, quote-unquote, malicious slander and, quote, part of a U.S.-backed scheme to interfere with the internal affairs of other countries, end quote. Europol has seized millions of euros worth of cash and Bitcoin and arrested 150 suspects involved in the dark web. That's a shadowy community of covert servers and web networks. Agents working with Operation Dark Hunter successfully confiscated 26.7 million euros. That's about $31 million worth of cash and virtual currencies. They also seized 45 guns and 516 pounds of drugs, including 25,000 ecstasy pills. And, I don't know, just based on the quality of the agents at Europol, I'm not sure they'll get as much use out of those drugs as the people they seized them from. A little bit morally prudes or something like that.
The ecstasy, yeah.
The ecstasy. I just don't think they're going to get much out of it. No, I'm just kidding. Hunger has risen to such extent in Afghanistan that parents are resolving to sell their children into marriage to afford food. Although hearing about it from Mark Sloboda, this has apparently been a practice that's been in practice for decades in the country. The headline we're reading here describes one such family whose daughter 6 years old, 18 months old, sold them both. The 6-year-old for the equivalent of $3,350, the 18-month-old for the equivalent of $2,800. The father has already made the agreement with 2 wealthy Afghans, stating they will all die if they do not go through with the sale. But again, that apparently is the status quo over there, and has been for decades.
On some level, is it not in the kid's best interest?
Oh, wait. Are you trying to justify this, Jamarl? What are you doing there?
If you think about it, you have a family, and the family is what? It's a cultural tradition.
No, I know. You're playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, I'm playing devil's advocate on this. If you have a family, is it really any different than the United States where they're giving up kids for adoption because they can't necessarily afford to take care of the kids?
Yeah, because they're selling them into marriage. Right. You're putting them in a situation where this kid is going to marry somebody. They have no choice of it.
Oh, they're marrying. See,
that's the whole thing.
I thought they were selling the kid into. Yeah, I didn't take it as they were selling them into marriage.
They were selling them into a marriage.
I thought it was a wealthy Afghan that was basically purchasing the kid for their own kids. But this is not that. No. They're basically selling the kid into some kind of marriage situation.
Well,
that's not the way I took it.
For their kids or for themselves, they're selling the kids into a marriage situation. The idea is that they're selling their own kids for those kids to be married.
Oh,
you see what I'm saying? So imagine you're an 18-month-old and your genetic family sells you to another family. You're going to be marrying some of them. And you grow up, the whole idea is, okay, my family sold me to this family and I'm supposed to marry.
Yeah, that's dark. I didn't take it that way. I took it as they were selling them into adoption.
No.
Oh,
No, because that's a lot more reasonable.
That's far more reasonable.
Yeah, selling kids into adoption that gets into some gray areas.
There's a wealthy Afghan family that wants a kid.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way I took it. That's like, okay, I can see a libertarian making
sounds like
a case.
U.S. type stuff. But no, this is different.
You're selling a kid into an early marriage.
This is far darker.
In Earth and Science news, the massive bomb cyclone that hit the West Coast here in the United States knocked out power to around 250,000 buildings. Well, that bomb cyclone is moving east, ripping through the east at this point, the East Coast. New York and New Jersey have already declared a state of emergency. As early as this morning, the storm could be preventing people from going to work in New England. Should expect 3 to 5 inches of rain per day over the next couple of days if you live in the Northeast. And we're kind of on the border of the Northeast right here in Washington, D.C., near North Virginia. We've been getting some rain, but I don't think we're going to get 3 to 5 inches. We'll see. In business news, a rumor circulating on Twitter is that John Gruden is claiming that Jeff Bezos is nearing a deal to buy the Washington football team, as Dan Snyder is being forced to sell it. That football team, formerly known as the Redskins, now kind of unnamed because, of course, the name is racist. Anyway, reports of Bezos eyeing NFL ownership date back to 2018. So if this comes to pass, it's been years in the coming. And in holiday news, today is National Day of the Deployed and also National Mincemeat Day. And then with that, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Those are our headlines.
National Mincemeat Day.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't know that was a thing. That's what I mean. It feels like there's so many holidays that they're basically undermining the premise of a holiday.
Like, it's like, should this be a holiday?
Yeah,
that kind
should
of
this
thing.
really be a holiday?
Although there was one last hour, because again, we get different headlines we get different holidays every hour when we go into it. There's one that last hour that really stuck out to me. I'm just trying to remember which one it was. There were a couple interesting ones last hour. I remember what it was like. National Howl at the Moon Day. Yeah, you remember that one? Right. I was like, that's a holiday right there if I ever saw one.
I mean, it's my mom sometimes like for Mother's Day or for Father's Day. She would send a card. And I was like, I don't have any kids. She was like, well, you have those dogs. And I was like, you realize that giving somebody a gift because they have dogs undermines the entire premise of Mother's Day and Father's Day, right? It just guts it. That's
really cute, though. That's really cute.
Yeah, it's cute. It's cute. But it's like, look, I just have dogs. That's not necessary. Unless there's like a dog mom or dog dad day or something.
Oh, that's what it is. You can be that way, right?
Yeah, I guess you could. I mean, at this point, you can make days on anything. I mean, if you have mincemeat day.
As we see every day, mincemeat day. The National Slap Your Coworker Day. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Conveniently placed on a weekend.
Basically put the person in prison. Yeah, man, some of the stuff is dark. Yeah, I didn't realize that that's what they were going with that. It's really dark. I'm going to marry my kid into a marriage for $3,300.
Also,
meaning, the responsibility of, it basically destroys any notion of that kid having any kind of say-so.
Yeah.
At the age of 18 months old.
Exactly. Arranged marriages in general, again, there are cultural differences, and it's not for me to be like, okay, you shouldn't do things this way, you should do things that way, whatever.
Yeah.
But arranged marriages in general, of course, common practices in certain parts of the world, always feels weird, I think, for a lot of Americans.
Yeah.
There are upsides to it, certainly. Like I can, removing the stress of having to find a partner, that's a big load off anybody's back. But then, of course, you get saddled in a relationship that doesn't work. The point being, there are cultural differences. This is on a whole other level.
Yeah.
Just selling your
These
kids,
are babies, basically.
selling them into marriages.
Yeah, it's dark.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between this and a dowry?
Well, that's a very valuable question. And that's why the dowry as a cultural practice is so weird when you look into it. And of course, the rise of romance and marrying out of love.
Strongly for the dowry.
Yes.
Like when we were in Kenya, speaking of Kenya, and they were like, do you have any kids? And I was like, no. I was like, what do you mean you don't have any kids? And we're at this, it was this coffee thing, and the woman was very aggressive, like not just her, but one of the techs, I was getting treatments there in Kenya. And they were like, you don't have any kids? What do you mean you don't have any kids? How old are you? Why don't you have it? Like going full in on this notion of it is a responsibility to have kids and you're supposed to have, et cetera. And one of the other women was making this point. What do you mean? A dowry is a great thing. The family gives the money to the wife, and et cetera. You didn't give your wife's family money when you got married. It's like, no. My wife is an adult. She has her own jobs and capabilities and everything else, and she doesn't necessarily require me to do that. And they was like, well, look, it's a good practice. It's something that people do. And it's like, dude, you're just familiar with it. Let's make a distinction between something that's a good practice from a God's point of view versus something that's just a cultural phenomena. But no, they would make that case very strongly. Like, the dowry is great. It gives the money to the parents and all. And I was trying to make the point to her that the society is different. This is not a situation where my wife is just waiting in the wings. My wife has her own job, her own car, her own, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She has her own life. It becomes less necessary, but people will make that argument.
100%. Well, but also the difference, and dowry's certainly important in different parts of the world, long history. And again, dowries still used in Western civilization. We still do them in our own more sort of ceremonial way with less money. But the other side of this is that that's a sort of culturally normalized practice that they've just gotten used to, and that's the thing they do. This seems pretty clearly like a sort of trauma response on a cultural level.
We need food.
We need food.
Die without
we're starving, and unless we sell our kids into this through this new institution we've created or whatever the last couple of decades, because again, it doesn't seem like hundreds of years. I don't know that much about it. I don't want to go too far out on a limb here. From what Mark Slobodka was saying about it, it's cultural, and it's the last couple of decades in response to outside forces invading and operating in the country and destabilizing it and causing lots of economic problems they're having to respond to. Austin said biggest country that still does arranged marriages is India. They have a 1% divorce rate. And I've heard people make arguments for arranged marriages, but again, I'd put that, and you're right, yes, India definitely associated with that. That's the main country I think of too, but that's different from this one. That's not what you weren't saying it was the same as this one.
No, I didn't take it that way.
That's
it was just arranged marriages. The divorce rate tends to be lower in a weird way. And I don't know if that's, again, a cultural thing. I don't know if that's, okay, we're together, we're going to make this work. I don't know what that is, but I've heard people argue that says, look, when people are getting together like that, they have this kind of meeting of the minds in regards to, okay, we're going to make this marriage work. And whether you don't necessarily know the person initially, over time you get to love and respect, et cetera, that's kind of built up in the relationship thing. I don't know. I mean, it's so different. I mean, in the United States, you choose your partner, right? It's like
you choose your partner, and that's partly like I think a Western thing. I mean, again, romance, the idea of romance or love or those kinds of things, clearly not just Western. But it seems like there was a shift in the West away from arranged marriages and politically advantageous marriages on a high level too. Yeah. You're falling in love with somebody, and it's that sort of personal passion and drive. And, all these cultural fixations, like the one true love, that kind of thing, those myths and things, maybe not myths, who knows? But
I think the one true love thing's a myth.
Yeah, but you hear what I'm saying. Those ideas, that those keystones seem to be our thing. Is my point.
Yeah, totally.
Different sides on this. A bunch of different ways this choice. Another thing, overchoice, or the idea of having too many choices, not being able to choose.
Which basically undermines the entire
Undermines
thing.
it, exhausts you. That's 100% a thing. And also the idea that in the West, I don't want to go too far out because I'm kind of going out on a limb, but that marriages, that people will hold out. You can see this in terms of people waiting longer before they decide to get married. It kind of combines with the one true love thing, where instead of getting married in their early 20s or whatever,
there's plenty of options.
It gets later and later and later. There are all these options, so many options, and you're waiting for the right one. You're waiting for the right purchase or buy transactionally in terms of I'm going to get into it with this perfect person, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that as a thing that's happening in the West, pushing back marriage dates, lowering the rate at which people are having kids, and undoubtedly increasing the divorce rate. That's a big cultural factor that we're still in the midst of, and it's a kind of crisis, I would say.
Yeah. What was the Rick and Morty episode where they created a device that would find your perfect love or something like that? And it would basically be people who are near you. And because it was so many people, it would be like, this person is a great match. They'd hook up with that person, and here's another person who's a great match. Yeah. And after a while, you had this thing where people were getting together in these kind of flings back and forth just because, they were always available, and you can undermine the prospect of having the marriage thing. I don't know. I mean, the one true love thing seems to, in a weird way, repudiate the notion that there's several different options out there. And whether it's one true or several different options, I don't necessarily know which one of those it's more cancerous. But who knows? I don't know. It's just a different way of doing it. And each society's kind of evolved to accommodate those various ways.
Yeah. So, let's close it out.
Yeah.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we are going to be speaking with Garland Nixon, talking about the Facebook whistleblower that was never a whistleblower at all. We're talking about Frances Haugen and your testimony in the UK yesterday. We're also going to be talking about Reddit, just social media companies, big companies in general, banning speech they don't like, and this push on the back end to try to get them to do more of it. We're going to be talking about Reddit taking down this post, making fun of a politician, and what seems to be, again, just another instance, another more and more frequent example of clear, politically heavy-handed control of what people are allowed to say online. We're coming back, talking about this with Garland Nixon. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're joined by Garland Nixon. Garland, Sputnik political analyst, co-host of the Critical Hour, here on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. Follow him on Twitter, @Garland Nixon. Garland, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, thank you so much for following through. Thank you so much for being here. Let's get into it. Talking about Frances Haugen, the Facebook quote-unquote whistleblower, and we might want to address the use of the term whistleblower in this case. because it's just another sort of debasement of that term. Following years of the debasement of the term whistleblower under Trump during Russiagate, with all these quote-unquote whistleblowers coming out, quote-unquote blow the whistle, which is, of course, not what they were doing. That was a political push at that time. Can't help but think there's a political push going on here right now to try to get social media companies to basically do more of what the Democrats want them to do, just setting it up like that. And Frances Haugen, of course, coming along, talking about how Facebook isn't doing enough to protect against bullying and against misinformation and against potential national security threats. Now, here is where a rub came into the story, and this is part of why I wanted to talk to you about this, is the intelligence angle. Frances Haugen, when she was working with Facebook, was working with their cyber espionage, their counter espionage, their counter intel department, basically. And we got to talking about this outside the studio yesterday. The idea that she is intel herself, that she's a whistleblower, there's another whistleblower who's sort of been resurrected more recently that people are also hearing from. The idea that the push to get her on platforms, talking to people, making the case that Facebook should be more moderated, more controlled, the idea that that was from intel from the beginning keeps coming to my mind. And you had some facts. You were talking about the hiring policies for that department in Facebook. Again, the counter-intel, counter-espionage department that Frances Haugen was working for inside of Facebook. They were hiring from the intelligence community. That's what you were telling me, right, Garland?
Yes, I followed that for quite a while. Basically, there were advertisements. This was a couple years ago, and they were advertising that they wanted to bring in people who were going to work with them to identify threats and to, act on them. And they were actively and openly saying, we want people who have experience in the intelligence community. So this is kind of the turning everything that we see and smell and breathe and touch into an intelligence operation. You turn on the mainstream media, and if you open a newspaper, you got to read an article that says anonymous intelligence sources said blah blah blah. If you go to CNN, hey, we now have former CIA blah 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 here to tell us this. And now, of course, on social media, they hired an entire unit that was made up of former intelligence, well, I use the word former guardedly, intelligence operatives. And it should be no shock that out of that came someone whose narrative aligns perfectly, a parallel narrative with the narrative that is coming from the U.S. State Department, the intelligence community, and the Congress. And the narrative is the government must mediate discussions on social media platforms. And, even her discussion where she was basically she was talking about it, and she was naming one by one the current boogeymen of the U.S. State Department, Myanmar, the Chinese Communist Party, Iran. She was just mumbling intelligence operations talking points. And I'm happy to say that the night that she went on 60 Minutes, the next morning I did a show on another show. The next day I did a show, and I talked about my suspicion because 8 o'clock at night, she's doing a interview with 60 Minutes about how terrible Facebook is. And the next 8 o'clock the next morning, when I look, every major media outlet in the nation and many throughout the NATO countries were basically putting her forward as a spokesperson and parroting everything that she said. And it was obvious from the beginning what's going on here, the weaponization of everything.
Would you call her a whistleblower, or would you call her something else in this case? I jokingly said the whistleblower who's not a whistleblower. But whistleblowers don't typically get this level of accolades. I mean, if you think of Assange, or you think of Chelsea Manning, or you think of Hale, who's basically being put in prison and treated like a terrorist, these are not whistleblowers that were basically, given these kind of accolades. I'm always skeptical of the whistleblower that people love. I'll put it that way. How do you consider her in this case, in the way that she's coming out with information?
See, when I determine if this person's a whistleblower, here's my question. Who are they blowing the whistle on behalf of? Cui bono, who benefits? They're so-called blowing the whistle on behalf of the intelligence community. They're a whistleblower that the CIA is saying, yeah, this is wonderful. Congress is saying, this is fantastic. We love this. This is awesome. We support her. So if you're a whistleblower on behalf of the most powerful people and the most treacherous entities on earth that are trying to overthrow governments, I don't I don't call that a whistleblower. You know, a whistleblower comes out of the CIA and says the CIA is doing something that they shouldn't be doing. A whistleblower doesn't come out of Facebook and say the CIA is right about Facebook. Let's all work with the CIA so we can have a better world. That's let's just say a tad bit suspicious, gentlemen.
Nah, it's a way to claim the space left over by Julian Assange, though. After, you know, I mean, it's a lot of people were shocked. I wasn't exactly shocked, but I get it. It's shocking. The fact that the CIA wanted to kidnap or kill Julian Assange, that came out a big week ago and has caused waves, and we'll see, hopefully it causes some real actual consequences in terms of getting him out of jail, ending this long process to get him extradited. But anyway, Assange, of course, was the hub for whistleblowers. WikiLeaks in general was the way that we came to know a lot of whistleblowers, and that was its only service, basically, was to serve as a clearinghouse kind of for whistleblowers to do their thing, release key documents. And in order to sort of pivot, I'm thinking like semantically here, to claim the space left over by Julian Assange, a lot of people like whistleblowers. The idea that they're, you know, governments are corrupt, that they do things they shouldn't do, and that Assange and people like him are there to flush it out and to show the world what's actually happening. People like that idea on a deeper level. And so, of course, the intel establishment, seeing that, my assumption is, intentionally tried to seize on the term when they're talking about any given issue, so that if you have an inside source who you can have, like a sleeper agent isn't the right idea, but it kind of gets some of the aspects across. If you can have somebody inside an institution and that institution is doing something you don't like, you can activate that source. They can come out, they can criticize it, you can call them a whistleblower, and suddenly you've got the media covering it, you've got a apparently grassroots backlash to whatever that organization is doing. We're talking about Facebook here, of course, but the idea that Frances Haugen was working with Intel when she was hired by Facebook, that she was put there to be an interface, to do the job that she was supposed to do there, but, you know, to interface with the CIA or the NSA or whomever, and that then, seeing that Facebook wasn't acting strongly enough to squash the kinds of opinions they wanted them to squash, the idea that they activated her, whatever that means, and I don't want to be too conspiratorial, but, you know, the idea that they went to her and like, hey, you want to come out and start to talk about the stuff you've been complaining to us about, you know, all working together, all with the same ideas. It makes perfect sense to me, and you don't need to get too conspiratorial, quote unquote. I'm not alleging anything more nefarious necessarily. It's just every step of it. It seems like the incentives are all in place. What do you think about that, Garland?
Well, I would go a step further than you're going, you know, and say that, you know, they hired a bunch of ostensibly a bunch of former intelligence operatives. They're not former intelligence operatives. They're intelligence operatives, and they are there to do the bidding of the intelligence community, to access everything Facebook has from the inside, and therefore they now have the credibility. You know, if somebody was outside and said Facebook's doing that, okay, you know, remember we've seen Project Veritas, some different people have inside whistleblowers come out, but they have their own people there, and they can portray her as an insider.
Yeah.
They're just there gathering information. They're just doing routine intelligence gathering operations to be used whenever they need to use it for whatever purposes they want, in my opinion.
And what are the purposes? I mean, under this model or under this situation? I mean, it seems that basically she's given various governments around the world exactly what they want. This notion of mitigating certain information while publishing other information, especially if it's directed at countries that we don't particularly like. I mean, is that where this is coming in at? This kind of, you know, we want the ability to mitigate some of the content and some of the information that's coming out of Facebook when it's disadvantageous to basically governmental structures? Or is there something more nefarious here going on in the reason and the way that she's coming out with this sort of information?
I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive. I think they see Facebook as a powerful tool, you know, and how can we use, what are the ways we can use that tool? I think the intelligence community is still exploring the many ways that they can use social media. But I think one of the things they see is we have to rope this thing in. Before we can use it, we have to control it. We can't have people on here talking about things that will be detrimental to our narrative. So they get inside, they figure out how they can control it, how they can use it. And one of the things that they see is a free and open conversation allows people to push back against their narratives and to learn things about their narratives. So once they get full control of it, now it is a tool that can be used as necessary whenever they need, you know, we're getting ready to try to overthrow government X. Let's put Facebook and Twitter and, let's put our social media plan into effect. We saw when there was a move on Cuba by the State Department a few months back, and we found out that there were some Twitter acts that were going on that were originating here and in Spain, and just that, they said, okay, let's all do this, and then everybody did it, and then they reported on it, and that's what they want all of social media to be, part of the matrix that they use to enact their various plans around the world, and unfortunately all too often inside the United States itself.
And I agree with you completely. That's the weird, and I feel like this kind of thing, I'll put it like this. You just used the word matrix. For a lot of people growing up in the 2000s or whatever, even familiar with the culture, they get exactly where you're going and the kinds of ideas that you're trying to get across. And admittedly, those ideas for some people are like, okay, it's a little bit tinfoil hatty. But I think gaining increasing traction because it's increasingly obvious to a lot of people that at least something like that is happening. That the constant arguments over censorship on social media and bullying and the push and pull, the tug of war, pulling in these opposite directions over how to control these platforms. On the back end, the reason that conversation is happening is very obvious, is that those platforms, those tools, super useful, super powerful. The idea that the government's going to want to use them, again, don't need to get too conspiratorial or whatever to actually assume that's what's happening on some level, whether it's good or it's bad or somewhere in between. There's another story. I mentioned this briefly, but Reddit, and this is, you're talking about, okay, they're exploring different ways about how to control, how to moderate, how to do that kind of thing. Going to Reddit, here's another way it works. Reddit, of course, has all these different subreddits. Reddit, sort of social media, not a social media site, but like a content posting site with a bit of community around it. All these different subreddits about different things. So there's shoe subreddits and travel subreddits and cooking subreddits and politics, etc. You just have these different forums. And each of those forums has moderators, right? Each of those subreddits is going to have a group of people that, it has an internal sort of organized structure. They're allowed to moderate what content gets posted. At the same time, though, what a lot of people have noticed is Reddit tends to lean a certain way politically. Reddit tends to lean left. And so across the board, in the vast majority of cases, you have moderators who lean left. And the company culture, when we were talking just outside, Garland, you brought up CEO of Reddit, former Intel, turns out. Mm-hmm. Anyway, here's the actual specific story. One of the subreddits the other day, somebody posts, Dave Chappelle did this recent skit. People are calling him transphobic. Well, there's a trans political activist who came out and was criticizing him. So somebody did some research on that critic, that political activist who ran as a politician. You might even call him a politician. They'd said some pretty screwed up stuff in their own comedy. They do comedy. In their own comedy, they'd said some pretty screwed up things about bashing Asian people over the head with phones. It's like, okay, you got some egg on your face too. So this person posts a video to the subreddit. They get taken down. Just a simple case of a moderator not liking what they have to say. And it's not even like a Democrat subreddit. The subreddit is literally cringe, designed to talk about cringy things, whatever. But that's another way that the suppression works, is it can be complete top-down algorithmic control, but you can also just have a kind of culture, like a diffused culture of, well, these are the kinds of things we endorse on this platform. And then the platform shift in a certain direction. So Reddit, I don't think that moderator got a message from George Soros telling them to take that post down. There's nothing that nefarious. But you have a culture where those moderators tend to take certain things down. That's what we see happening here. And it tends to lean in a certain direction. What do you think, Garland?
I'm with you. And what happens is this, and unfortunately, as they inject this thought process, and again, I'll use it, the weaponization of everything. As they inject this thought process into the culture, people adapt it as their own, and they think they came up with the idea. That's when propaganda is really, really working, when you believe something and you think it's your idea, right? So now it's basically this. Okay, let's say Dave Chappelle, whoever, says something and you don't like it or don't agree with it. Rather than having an intellectual and philosophical discussion about it, you aim the howitzers at him and try to blow him out of the water. Like that. So if there's an issue that arises, the most beneficial thing to all would be to have an intellectual and philosophical discussion, figure out who's involved, who feels why. What did he actually say? 90% of the people that I've talked to that go after Chappelle didn't watch his special. Didn't watch it, have no clue what's in it, right? So even then, that's part of the discussion. Why is everybody talking about something that they didn't watch? Why do people feel so comfortable doing a movie review of a movie that they never watched? Well, isn't that part of the problem? But the bottom line is, This is, it has been injected to people to have a reaction. Something was said, and it isn't that you know that it was right or wrong. It starts to get inculcated into the conversation that it's wrong. And you just say, well, everybody's saying that it's wrong. It must be wrong. How can we attack this person? How can we tear them to pieces? That's anti-intellectualism. You don't start off by saying, well, I better watch it to figure out what my take is on it. You just say, well, everybody says it's wrong. We got to attack this person. So it now becomes using minorities as human shields.
Well, yeah, it's members of their cult, basically, that agrees with the position. They're on the wavelength of the cult, and they just runs with it. And so they don't need to see it at that point. This guy who I like, and that guy who I like, and that guy who I like says it's transphobic, and so it's transphobic. And yeah, couldn't necessarily make the argument one way or the other to back it up outside of what they've just been told. Yeah, it's unfortunate. The Chappelle thing was I'm sorry, funny. And Chappelle is an equal opportunity actor or comedian in this case, meaning everybody's fair game. It's not like, in fact, you can even make an argument that it would be transphobic for him not to do that if indeed the comedy was there, if that makes sense, in somewhat of a weird way. It's like, I'm not going to, like, this group is not part of our society, and because this group is not part of the society, I'm going to kind of exclude them from the comedy and everything else. I mean, that's somewhat of a treacherous or out there argument to make for that. But on some level, I think it's kind of true. If David Chappelle looks at everybody as equal opportunity for jokes, and yet he's saying, okay, I'm going to exclude this one community for whatever particular reason, that gets a little dicey. I didn't see any of that stuff as being transphobic. It's comedy. And I didn't necessarily take it as mean-spirited or otherwise. In fact, on some level, he was probably poking the bear just because it was a bear to be poked in the first place. But let me ask you this. I wanted to move on to a different topic. I mean, I want to get into some of the politics stuff, but Stephen Donziger, he goes on his appellate court cases today. He has been in house arrest or under house arrest for 812 days. At 12 a.m. today, there's going to be an appellate court to decide on whether or not he's going to jail for 6 months. And again, all of this was for a misdemeanor. None of this stuff was by a jury of his peers. And not by a jury of his peers. It wasn't even where the federal government said, yes, let's go with this. This was all done by basically a private corporation and multiple judges, because the private corporation lost a case of $9 billion. Donziger, in a recent conversation, basically, this is The Nation. He says, there are individuals within Chevron who want to destroy my life because they're angry at the role I've played in helping previously marginalized people to empower themselves to such an extent that they were actually able to win a legal case against Chevron. Those people in Chevron never expected for this to happen. They feel they were in charge. Their views are very racist. They say that they see the people in Ecuador as weak and dumb. He also added, there's a particular vitriol for a guy like me who comes from a place of privilege, who went to Harvard Law, who dedicates so much of his life to fighting them. It's almost like they see me as someone who betrayed their class. They have to try and destroy what I represent. He has a point there, and not just a point there. It is disturbing, to put it mildly, that something like this can happen in a banana republic, let alone happen in the United States. What are your thoughts about this? I mean, and I guess this is two questions. How do you think this appellate court case is going to turn out? And again, I know that's just kind of a up there question, but on secondary part to that, what is your perspective of this? You've watched this case, you've seen it just like we have. What are your thoughts?
I think this was inevitable as a result of NAFTA, right? This was inevitable. What happened here? When you look at NAFTA, when you look at these treaties, TPP, et cetera, what do? They set up a court system. So if something happens in my country with a corporation that's a part of NAFTA or whatever, I can't sue the company in my state or in my country. I have to sue them or go to some kind of a court that's been set up as a part of whatever this treaty is. And the people who run that court are chosen by the corporations who are involved.
Yeah, the TPP had like a tribunal made up of corporate lawyers or something to that effect.
Exactly. They choose the corporate lawyers. They choose the judge, jury, and advocate. You go before their judge, jury, and advocate, and you lose, right? And it's like the war on terror, the things that they've been doing in other countries, they're bringing home. This whole NAFTA thing, it was inevitable with globalism. They're bringing that same kind of thing home where now the corporations can say, you know what, I'm going to pick the judge. And then that judge is going to move forward. And because the corporations have really taken control of our government, the corporation and the government are one. It's not that the corporation is doing the bidding of the government any more than my hand is doing the bidding of the rest of my body. So it was inevitable. This is the globalist kind of thing coming home. You know, it kind of reminds me, if you study the robber barons, where when Rockefeller was kind of at war with the Erie Railroad guys, right? What did they do? They would brag, I've got a federal judge. No, I own this federal judge, and I'll go to my federal judge, and he'll make a finding against you. Oh, yeah? Well, I'll go to my federal judge, and he'll make a finding against you. They bragged about owning their own judge, owning their own senator. We've returned there. It's not an accident that the inequality of the robber baron age has returned, and in order to maintain that inequality in power, they have to have the same mechanisms of power set up. They've completely taken control of the government, and the government and the corporations are one, and now they're controlling the criminal justice system, as it were. It's just a corporate system of injustice.
Well, anti-corporate pushback that I see happening right now, it seems to be fixated when people have anti-corporate feelings and they're vocalized in political language and they're brought into the political sphere. When they're politically important at this point, it's about the tech companies, kind of reuniting the topics here. And Stephen Donziger, by the way, on the topic here, Amnesty International calling a lot of people to talk about his case. Big thing for them to do, and good on them for doing it. But Stephen Donziger, a lot happening right now, and definitely, if you've been following this case, give him your support. So thank you for bringing that up, Jamarl. But when we scrutinize and when we talk about big corporations, it seems to be tech companies at this point. That's what I hear, the antitrust push. That's the fixation there, of course. And the way that conversation is happening, I kind of want to come back to this one for a second, this conversation, Jamarl, because we were having it earlier. It's like Democrats on the one side pushing for more suppression of speech, Republicans on the other side, in some cases pushing for less, but they're still okay with, doing it when it's a useful weapon against China. I've seen them defending that in terms of, which platforms we should allow people to have on, whether we should be blocking certain opinions overseas. If Facebook, for instance, should be working more with other governments to suppress opinions. I've seen Republicans have slightly more convoluted opinions about that. But Garland, this conversation about, okay, when we talk about monopoly, when we talk about corporate overreach, it's often tech companies. And when we have those conversations, they're usually trying to push the tech companies to have more rights, more powers, not less. That seems to be, like the robber baron conversation, even though Jeff Bezos is rich as sin and people will make fun of him for it, the big pushback against corporations seems like it would strengthen the corporations they're targeting right now. Do you see that? What do you think about it?
I think it's not a pushback. It's a push to align them with government powers. That's all it is. It's not a pushback. It's how can we better align them with the powers who are, controlling things. So it's more an alignment to make sure everybody's on the same page, I think. And unfortunately, gentlemen, I have to run.
Oh, you got to go. Yeah, Garland, I heard you had to go this morning. Have a great day. Have a great show. For those listening, Garland Nixon joining us. He is the host on this network of the Critical Hour, Sputnik political analyst. And again, Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. Check that out every day, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. Also follow Garland on Twitter, @GarlandNixon, and check him out on Facebook and on YouTube. Again, Garland Nixon. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break. Coming back in a minute, taking your calls and closing out the show today. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. And we've got callers, and we're taking more. 202-521-1320. Malik, first up, calling in from D.C. Malik, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Good morning, guys. Thanks for taking my call. Initially, what piqued my interest this morning was you guys, the news story in regards to the people selling their children into marriage in Afghanistan. It piqued my interest, and it immediately made me think of, and not that it's exactly the same thing, but it made me think of some of the things in this culture that are generally accepted. And I've listened to some of your commentary where you were talking about, a marriage in the United States and the freedom to choose your own partner and so on and so forth. And a lot of this stuff, and even the discussion that you just had with Garland, is often it's a matter of perspective and culture and exposure. There was a story, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. There was a story some years ago, maybe a decade or more, that young women in the United States were engaged in prostitution in malls across America, hanging out in shopping malls and having young guys or maybe even older guys buy them things that they wanted, clothing, purses, whatever, what have you.
Like sugar daddies.
In exchange, what's that?
Sugar daddies. There's even like a sugar daddy website, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Well, sugar daddies or sugar daddy for the day. Sex, right? But largely, when I looked into mainstream media and would scan, media online, I couldn't find this story in most places, right? So, and in terms of the whole thing with Fauci and the perception around vaccines and what's true and what is the efficacy of the vaccines and so on and so forth, and who's a conspiracy theorist and who's not, oftentimes has to do with a matter of, and Jamal, you talked months ago about, I guess in some of your debates with Kim Iverson, you had to question yourself, do I live in a bubble? Do we all live in our own particular bubbles? And I don't want to mention my comrade who calls in sometimes. I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember. Brother calls in sometimes.
Could be Brave.
Brave. I'm sorry, Brave. Wow, how could I forget his name? And I think and I believe when I call in, and also when he calls in, it's an attempt to bridge the gap. And
I appreciate it. I like that, and that's why I like it. I'm sorry for cutting in, Malik.
No.
I appreciate that. No, I like the fact that you guys are trying to bridge the divide. We do that too. Heck, the name of the show is Fault Lines, and it's not, in my opinion, because all these fissures. We're trying to create divisions. No, it's because we recognize that there are divisions, and we're trying to bridge those gaps through conversation. I think that's a large part of what the show is about, and that's why we like having you guys call in. We disagree. But the whole point, when you disagree, I would hope, is to keep talking about it, as much as that seems productive. And even if you agree to disagree, if you like each other, at the end of the day, that's humanity, right? On so many things, we're forced to it. I don't mean to get too philosophical here, but I do see you guys bridging the gap when you call in on the other side of this COVID stuff specifically, because, of course, I get that's kind of where a lot of that is focused. And what's sad to me is that we talk about this in the back room, left and right, a lot of the populist momentum in general has been distracted and divided, and the community has been divided over this issue where a lot of people are fighting and there's a lot of infighting going on. And the tension between the bubbles on this one the surface tension has gotten pretty taut. It's gotten pretty tense. I don't know how to put it. Maybe, again, a bit too philosophical, but my point is I appreciate you trying to bridge the gaps. It's sad that in some sense that these gaps are as strong as they are right now, but I appreciate it. We try to do the same thing, Malik.
And I appreciate that, I'll jump off. But if you guys would, sometimes keep that in mind when I guess the masses often seem like they're being reactionary in terms of the information that's coming out of the government in terms of the vaccines and whether or not people feel these injections are safe or not. That you're not necessarily come from a place, because sometimes it appears that even you guys sometimes come from a place of frustration with folks with divergent opinion.
Could be. Yeah, I mean,
depends on what it is.
Yeah, it depends on what it is. And yeah, we're human. We got our biases too, man. I'm not trying to say we're above any of that stuff, but we try. We pretty consistently try. And I think that's a large part of what separates us out from a lot of the rest of the mainstream media is, and often they don't try. Editorially, they're bound to not try. And I feel like we're a lot less bound that way. And I think we do try. But I hear the criticism, and I'll try to pay more attention for that. Malik, thank you for the call. We have also calling in now Michael from Silver Spring. Michael, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yes. I heard the other caller, the one that spoke about an hour ago, regarding the Facebook thing. I think the reason why they're getting these congressional hearings and everything is because they're a publisher versus a non-publisher. And that's a new sort of legal term that applies specifically to social media places. And as a publisher, think of it like a newspaper. That's what enables them to take away posts and cancel accounts. But as a non-publisher, the idea is that every individual posts their own content. It's like everyone actually owns the site. That's what people and the last caller, he was asking whether we think that people should be able to post content and just as long as it's not illegal. And that's the non-publisher point of view. I think that he's like, that's what because you have to decide.
Wait, are you trying to say platform? Or are you creating something new called non-publisher?
No, non-publisher like the platform way. No, I think, yeah, right? Michael, you're just saying non-publishers are platforms, right?
No, I'm saying like it's like a legal thing now. Like I'm pretty sure that's the term that the last caller used it too. Is publisher. If you're a publisher, you have certain requirements. You
totally
have obscene language. You can't have. You have to be reasonable. And what we're seeing now, as Garland Nixon said, is like the Congress walking us through this new era that we're in, where because I forget where I'm going, but basically, as a publisher, this is where we're at.
Yeah, well, yes, and we've had this conversation, but I forget if it was last week or if it was yesterday. Sometimes my mind slips on this kind of thing. But I've made the point before too, where I think it was last week, the dichotomy between publisher and platform, which has been the prevailing one on this discussion, kind of doesn't make sense to me anymore for a couple of reasons. Not least of which, and we did get to this with Garland, I think they're just going to game the rules whatever way they can. They're going to try to make publishers and platforms are going to get. Oh, we didn't get this specifically with Garland.
This was earlier in the show. Earlier.
It was earlier.
Basically, they're trying to get the best of both worlds.
They're going to try to get the best of both worlds with it.
This thing has the defenses of a platform, even though they're basically acting like a publisher in the way that they censor certain content and get rid of certain content, legal or not.
And specifically, the whole idea here is that platforms have a liability shield where they're not going to be held to account for things that their users post on the platform. That's, I think, the core difference. That's the core responsibility that you can understand here, which is it's on the user's end. If the user, exactly, if the user posts something screwed up on Facebook, say, it's not Facebook's fault, right, as it would be if they were a publisher, if they ran a newspaper, for instance, and every editorial, every op-ed, whatever, every piece they had to run, they had to check it, you know. With a platform with Facebook, it's a lot more open, and so I think that's the key legal distinction. But again, if they're going to try to get the best of both worlds, if they want to be able to suppress speech, and they don't want, you know, and corporations certainly don't want to be liable for it, well, they're going to find a new definition. We're going to confuse ourselves with it. We have other callers. Eric calling in from Florida, and 202-521-1320. By the way, Eric calling in from Florida. What's on your mind?
Hey, Shane, I just want to let you know that Reddit did actually hire a quote-unquote former CIA employee. And also, when you say the place is left, I think you're being a little vague there. They're more like neoliberal, which is not really left. That's still right. So, yeah.
I don't know if it's left or right. This is where these definitions break down: neoliberal, neoconservative.
Anti-capitalists are left. You have to be anti-capitalist to be left. So these are not anti-capitalists. These are full-on neolibs, and they're just as right-wing as they come.
Even that on Reddit, so I don't necessarily know one way or the other about it.
You said you're just not on Reddit that much?
I've never been on Reddit.
I would agree that, yeah, they're more neoliberal, but I think if you encountered a neoliberal in the woods, based on a lot of stuff they're saying, just in the streets, a wild neoliberal, you'd think they're on the left based on some of the stuff they're saying. And I get you're making a sort of critical distinction, and we don't need to get into it because at a certain point it's just literally arguing semantics. What are the definitions of these words? I understand the point you're making, but anything else there, Eric?
No, that's it.
Okay.
Thanks, my man.
Thanks.
Thanks for the call, Eric. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. And he's right. They are neoliberal. They're broadly pro-business. And this is something that I didn't exactly get into with Garland earlier. But he will often bring up the idea that the system, the apparently two-party system, is a monolith.
Yes.
There's a sort of unibrow that that connects the two sides of the political spectrum, and they represent the same interest. We say something very similar quite frequently on this show.
I mean, it seems to be this kind of minor differences.
And so with Reddit, the idea, it's not that they're pro-Democrat necessarily, although they often are. It's just they're pro-establishment in a lot of ways. When it's left, it's good. When it's right, they'll do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think neoliberal is a fair description of Reddit specifically. But with sort of more woke cultural views, which is where I think for a lot of people they would get confused and think of them as left-wing.
Yeah.
Because a lot of neoliberals, like in this case, it's a woke thing.
It's like what the CIA was like. We have, I'm a Latino woman, and I'm part of the CNA. Yeah. I can murder with the best of the guys. It's like, okay, I appreciate your wokeness-ish, whatever that means. But no, I get his point. Totally get his point. Yeah, I haven't used Reddit like that. Like I haven't been. I think I've maybe seen Reddit maybe once or twice, but I haven't necessarily been going through the links and everything else where I would be entirely aware of it. But I take your word for it. I mean, if that's the way it kind of breaks out, that's where it breaks out. But I do think there's a difference between this kind of neoliberal stuff and versus the left, even though I know what you mean. Like oftentimes people would consider Democrats the left if somebody wasn't necessarily heavy in the political, ideological dialogue and discussions and everything else. Just the very act of, the Democratic Party believing that that's the left component of this country and everything else. And sometimes you'll be talking to conservatives and they would make a comment of like, the news media is to the left. And it's like, those guys are not to the left. I always grit my teeth when they say that. Like CNN is the left. It's like, they're not the left. They're like corporate media or something to that effect. But I don't know. These political distinctions get a little warped at a certain point.
They completely do, intentionally.
Yeah.
Intentionally trying to mix labels and obfuscate things so it can be like, well, Democrats are the left or Republicans are the right, when a lot of people on the right see a lot of things they don't like about Republicans and see them moving left in different ways, and a lot of people on the left who don't like Democrats see them moving right in various ways.
Yeah, point that stuff out.
It's intentional. It is, actually.
So coming up this week, before we close, is budget negotiations. And unfortunately, this is still going on. This is aggravating to me. There are only, 5 days left before they come to some kind of agreement and some kind of deal. And you have Jamarl, who basically said, as Senator Manchin said, you don't know what everything that's in it until the text of the reconciliation bill is drafted. As my understanding is that we're pretty close on the text, so let's just get right to it, get it done. Hopefully we can have this within a week at most. We've been ready, but obviously there are two senators that have to get on for full agreement. We're really close. I think we can just take another week and finalize all of the details. What do you mean another week? This is like, we're at October 26th.
The last chance.
Yeah, this is like the last chance. And they're talking about this stuff is supposed to be done by the 31st. And more importantly, I mean, when you get to the nub of it, these guys are against increasing climate change legislation, expansion of Medicare, increasing taxes on the rich and whatnot. And to make it worse, they're trying to find a way to increase taxes on the rich without increasing taxes on the rich, which is a head exploding thing at this point. It seems as if Joe Biden's party has conspired to ensure that he fails miserably, not just in the sense of coming up in the midterms, but also his election as a whole. Because I got to be honest, at the point where the midterms go, if they lose the House or the Senate, this is over with. And if you think about all the things that Biden wanted to get accomplished, said he was going to get accomplished, even things that he had the power to do, meaning the legalization of pot was in his power. He could have taken that scheduling for that. He could have made certain changes in regards to getting rid of certain college debt. Didn't do it. Even the $15 an hour minimum wage, where he had the potential to push for that, didn't even push for it. Like, these are things that he explicitly said, I, Joe Biden, am going to do. We got to fight China. We got to do all of this stuff to invest in America. And lo and behold, what has he gotten accomplished? Goose egg. Goose egg. And so this notion of people leaving him in the polling and everything else, let's be very clear, that's not anything the Republicans have done. That's entirely Biden and his party himself. Can't put this failing on Republicans, put it where it deserves and where it demands, and that's on the Democrats.
You got to figure out what they got wrong here in terms of messaging and.
I mean, they just didn't do anything.
Not negotiating, not actually doing anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's the issue of not getting anything done. I mean, they wanted the House and the Senate. Congratulations, the American public gave it to you. What did you do with it?
Kinda, but even then, they didn't have Manchin or Sinema, right?
They're supposed to be Democrats.
Supposed to be.
They're supposed to be Democrats.
But according to whom, I don't know. We got to close this show out. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Eastern, folks. Have a great day. Signing off. See you on the other side.